Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Highway That Remembers, from Marcus Chen. The thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that you know every mile marker, every pothole, every curve by heart. Interstate 47 through the Nevada desert had become as familiar to me as my own reflection, which is why I noticed immediately when something was wrong that October night. I'd been hauling electronics from Reno to Phoenix, the same run I made twice a month. My 18-wheeler loaded down with pallets of computer components that hummed softly in their packaging behind me. The desert air was crisp and clean through my slightly cracked window, carrying that distinctive sage and dust scent that I'd grown to love over the years. My headlights carved through the darkness ahead, illuminating the yellow lines that had guided me safely through countless nights just like this one. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show discussing UFO sightings in the area, which seemed fitting given the endless expanse of star-filled sky stretching above me like a vast black ocean dotted with diamonds. It was just past 2 in the morning when I first noticed the road wasn't behaving the way it should. I'd been driving for about 3 hours since my last rest stop, feeling alert and comfortable behind the wheel of my Peterbilt 379, her diesel engine purring with that steady, reassuring rumble that had lulled me through so many nights. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. My coffee was still warm in the thermos and I was making good time. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for one small detail that nagged at the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite locate. The mile markers weren't progressing the way they were supposed to. I'd passed mile marker 127 about 10 minutes ago, and I should have been approaching 130 by now. But when I caught sight of the next reflective green sign in my headlights, it read 125. I rubbed my eyes, thinking fatigue might be playing tricks on me, but the numbers were clear and unmistakable. Somehow I was moving backwards along the highway, even though my speedometer showed a steady 65 miles per hour, and my truck was definitely moving forward. The radio crackled with static, and the talk show host's voice became distorted, his words stretching and warping like a recording played at the wrong speed. I reached over to adjust the tuning, but as my fingers touched the dial, the static cleared and I could hear him speaking normally again, though his words sent a chill down my spine. He was talking about drivers who had reported strange experiences on desert highways, stories of roads that seemed to loop back on themselves, of truckers who found themselves driving the same stretch of asphalt over and over again without understanding how or why. The landscape outside my windows looked exactly as it always did. The same rocky outcroppings and scrub brush, the same distant mountain silhouettes against the star-filled sky. But there was something subtly different, as if I were seeing a photograph of the desert rather than the desert itself. The shadows seemed too deep, too perfectly placed, and the way the moonlight fell across the landscape had an artificial quality that made me increasingly uneasy. I pressed a little harder on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb to 70, then 75. The engine responded beautifully, the familiar vibration of increased power traveling through the steering wheel into my hands. But when the next mile marker appeared in my headlights, it read 123. I was definitely moving backwards along the highway, despite every indication that I was traveling forward at normal speed. The radio host's voice continued to describe phenomena that seemed impossible, stories of time distortions and spatial anomalies that supposedly occurred in certain remote areas where the boundary between normal reality and something else became thin and permeable. He spoke in measured clinical tones about quantum mechanics and parallel dimensions, theories that attempted to explain the unexplainable. Under normal circumstances, I would have dismissed it all as late-night entertainment, designed to keep insomniacs company. But given my current situation, every word seemed to carry weight and significance. I tried my CB radio, hoping to reach another driver who might be able to shed some light on what was happening. But all I got was static mixed with what sounded like voices speaking in reverse. Words that formed no recognizable language but somehow conveyed a sense of urgency and warning. The sound made my skin crawl and I quickly switched it off, preferring the relative silence broken only by my engine's steady rumble and the whisper of wind past my mirrors. Mile marker 121 appeared next, then 119, then 117. With each passing sign, my unease grew stronger, settling in my stomach like cold lead. I'd been driving professionally for over 20 years, had crossed every major highway in the continental United States, and I'd never experienced anything remotely like this. Roads simply didn't work this way. There had to be a logical explanation, some trick of perception or fatigue-induced confusion that was making me misread the signs. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The numbers were clear, the progression was unmistakable, and my truck's instruments showed everything functioning normally. Somehow I was traveling backwards through space while moving forward through time, caught in some kind of impossible loop that defied every law of physics I understood. The desert around me began to change in subtle ways. The rock formations seemed to shift and flow like liquid stone, rearranging themselves into new configurations when I wasn't looking directly at them. The scrub brush appeared to lean inward toward the highway, as if drawn by some invisible force, and the mountains in the distance flickered occasionally like a television screen with poor reception. When I saw mile marker 115, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. There were tire tracks in the sand beside the road, deep ruts left by a heavy truck, and they looked exactly like the treads on my own 18-wheeler. The tracks ran parallel to the highway for several hundred yards before disappearing into the darkness, as if another version of my truck had passed this way recently, or perhaps as if I had passed this way before without remembering it. The radio crackled again, and this time I heard my own voice coming through the speakers, distorted and strange but unmistakably mine. I was saying something about mile markers and backwards progression, describing my exact situation in words I didn't remember speaking. The sound of my own voice coming from the radio filled me with a terror I'd never experienced before, a primal fear that seemed to reach into my chest and squeeze my heart with icy fingers. I grabbed the radio and shouted into it, asking who was there, demanding an explanation, but my voice only emerged from the speakers a few seconds later, layered over itself in a cacophony of confused questions and desperate pleas. The radio had become some kind of echo chamber, reflecting my words back to me from different points in time, creating a conversation with myself that made no sense and offered no comfort. Mile marker 113 passed by, then 111, then 109. The backwards progression continued relentlessly, and I began to realize that I might be trapped in this impossible situation indefinitely. The thought of driving forever through this distorted version of reality, watching the numbers count down towards some unknown destination, filled me with a panic that threatened to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. But then I saw something in the distance that offered a glimmer of hope. There were lights ahead, the familiar glow of a truck stop or rest area, warm and welcoming against the alien darkness that surrounded me. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach that beacon of normalcy, to find other people who might be able to explain what was happening or offer some way out of this nightmare. As I drew closer, however, I realized that the lights weren't coming from a truck stop at all. They were headlights, the distinctive configuration of another 18-wheeler traveling toward me in the opposite lane. But as the truck passed me, I caught a glimpse of the driver through his window and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was me, looking exactly as I did now, staring back at myself with the same expression of terror and confusion that I knew was written across my own face. The other truck disappeared into the darkness behind me, but I could see its taillights in my mirrors, red dots that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. I was sharing this impossible highway with other versions of myself, all of us trapped in the same backwards journey, all of us searching for an escape that might not exist. Mile marker 107 appeared in my headlights, and I made a decision that might have been born of desperation or inspiration. Instead of continuing straight ahead, I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, taking my truck off the highway and into the desert itself. The sand grabbed at my wheels and my engine strained against the sudden resistance, but I kept my foot on the accelerator, determined to break free from whatever force had been holding me to that backwards road. For several terrifying minutes, I drove blindly across the desert, my headlights illuminating nothing but endless sand and rock. No signs of civilization or hope. The overpass without shadows. From Marcus Chen. The thing about driving long haul is that you notice patterns in the landscape that most folks never see. After 15 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt 389, I've memorized every mile marker between Seattle and Phoenix, every truck stop coffee that tastes like motor oil, and every overpass that casts its familiar shadow across the interstate. Which is why I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the Millfield Road overpass that Tuesday night in October, standing there against the star-drunk sky without casting a single shadow on the asphalt below. I was hauling a load of electronics down Interstate 84, somewhere in the high desert country of eastern Oregon, where the sagebrush stretches to the horizon and the nearest town is just a collection of grain silos and abandoned gas stations. The night was clear and cold, with a full moon hanging like a silver coin above the basalt cliffs, bright enough that I could make out the texture of the rock faces without my high beams. My CB radio crackled occasionally, with the distant chatter of other drivers, but mostly it was just me and the steady thrum of my Caterpillar engine, that familiar vibration that had become as comforting as a heartbeat over the years. The overpass appeared in my headlights about 2 miles out, a simple concrete structure spanning the 4 lanes of interstate. Nothing fancy about it, just the kind of utilitarian bridge that carries farm roads over highways in 1,000 places across the American West. But as I got closer, something started nagging at the back of my mind, the way a half-remembered dream will surface when you're not quite awake yet. The moonlight was so bright that everything cast sharp, dark shadows. The guardrails, the mile markers, even the small rocks scattered along the shoulder. Everything except the overpass itself. I eased off the accelerator and let my rig slow as I approached, the Jake brake rumbling like distant thunder. The absence of shadow was so complete it seemed almost aggressive, as if the bridge existed in some pocket of space where the laws of light and darkness had been suspended. The concrete looked normal enough, maybe a little newer than I remembered, but there was something about the way it seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it that made the hair on my neck stand up. My CB squawked, and a voice I didn't recognize came through the static, calm and conversational as if we were old friends catching up over coffee. "Evening, Peterbilt. Notice anything unusual about that overpass?" The voice had a slight accent I couldn't place, maybe European, with the careful pronunciation of someone speaking a second language. I keyed the mic, grateful to hear another human voice in that empty landscape. "Yeah, actually, the shadows seem a bit off. You seeing the same thing?" I kept my tone casual, but my grip tightened on the steering wheel as I rolled under the bridge at about 30 miles per hour. The moment I passed beneath the concrete span, the temperature in my cab dropped at least 10 degrees, and my breath came out in visible puffs. "The shadows," the voice repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, they're quite absent, aren't they? Tell me, driver, how many times have you passed this way before?" There was something in his tone that suggested he already knew the answer, the way a doctor asks how you're feeling when he's already read your test results. I checked my mirrors as the overpass receded behind me, and that's when I noticed that my trailer, all 53 feet of it, hadn't cast a shadow either during the few seconds it took to pass underneath. "I run this route twice a month," Lenny said into the mic. "Been doing it for about 8 years now. Never seen anything like this before." The radio was quiet for a long moment, filled only with the soft hiss of static and the distant whisper of atmospheric interference. When the voice came back, it seemed closer somehow, more intimate. as if the speaker had moved from across a room to lean over my shoulder. 8 years is a considerable time to establish a pattern. Memory is such a curious thing, though, isn't it? Sometimes we remember things that never happened, and sometimes we forget things that did. I glanced at the GPS mounted on my dashboard, a reliable Garmin that had guided me through countless nights just like this one. The screen showed my location exactly where I expected it to be, mile marker 247 on Interstate 84, but there was no indication of any overpass in the vicinity. According to the satellite data, I was driving through empty desert with nothing but open sky above me. The next truck stop was 40 miles ahead at the junction with Highway 19, a place called Desert Rose Travel Plaza that served decent pie and kept their restrooms clean. I'd been planning to push through to Baker City, but something about the wrongness of that overpass made me reconsider. Sometimes the road shows you things that don't want to be seen, and the smart driver knows when to take a break and let his mind catch up with what his eyes have witnessed. My CB crackled again, and the same voice came through, now accompanied by what sounded like classical music playing softly in the background. "You're thinking of stopping soon," he said, and it wasn't a question. The Desert Rose, perhaps? They make an excellent cherry pie there, though I suspect you prefer the apple. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. I did prefer apple pie, had been ordering it at the Desert Rose for years, but that wasn't the kind of information you'd share over the CB with a stranger. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's your 20? Instead of answering, the voice continued as if I hadn't spoken. "The thing about overpasses without shadows is that they exist in the spaces between things, between what was and what will be, between memory and forgetting. They're doorways in a sense, though most people pass through them without ever noticing what lies on the other side." I looked in my side mirrors again, scanning the road behind me for any sign of another truck, but the interstate stretched empty in both directions, a ribbon of asphalt under the moonlight with nothing moving except my own rig. The desert on either side was a study in silver and black, sculpted by shadows that seemed too deep and too dark for the brightness of the night. "I don't see you back there," I said into the microphone. "Where exactly are you broadcasting from?" The laughter that came through the speaker was warm and genuinely amused, the kind of laugh you might hear at a family gathering or a friendly poker game. "Oh, I'm much closer than you think. In fact, I'd say we're practically traveling together now. You pass through my little doorway, you see, and that changes things. That creates possibilities." I felt a sudden urge to pull over, to stop the truck and get out to inspect my rig, to make sure everything was normal and solid and real. But something stronger than logic told me to keep moving, to maintain momentum, because stopping in this place might mean never starting again. The engine note of my Peterbilt had taken on a slightly different quality. Still the familiar rumble of the cat engine, but with harmonic overtones that seemed to come from somewhere outside the truck entirely. The landscape around me began to shift in subtle ways that were hard to define. The sagebrush looked the same, and the distant mountains maintained their familiar profiles, but the spaces between things seemed larger somehow, as if the desert had been stretched like taffy. The mile markers still appeared at regular intervals, but the numbers no longer followed any sequence I could understand, jumping from 251 to 239 to 264 without apparent logic. "Time works differently here," the voice explained conversationally. "Distance too. You might find that your usual landmarks don't appear when you expect them to. The Desert Rose, for instance, might be much further away than you remember, or much closer. These things tend to fluctuate. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, same as it had 20 miles back, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. I tried to radio other drivers on the usual channels, but the airwaves were silent except for that persistent static and the occasional burst of what might have been music or might have been voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The headlights of my truck began to reveal details in the landscape that shouldn't have been visible at this distance. rock formations and dry creek beds that were clearly miles away, but appeared with perfect clarity, as if I were looking through some kind of supernatural telescope. And still, despite the brightness of the moon and the power of my LED headlamps, nothing cast a shadow, not my truck, not the mile markers, not even my own hand when I held it up in front of the windshield. "The absence of shadows is just the beginning," the voice said, and I realized I hadn't keyed the microphone in several minutes. He was responding to thoughts I hadn't spoken aloud. Shadow is memory, you see. It's the record of where you've been, the proof that you exist in a particular place at a particular time. The echo chamber. From Marcus. The thing about driving nights is that you start to depend on the radio more than you'd think. It becomes this lifeline connecting you to the world outside your cab. A reminder that civilization still exists beyond the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching into darkness. I've been pulling loads across the Midwest for going on 15 years now, and I thought I'd heard every kind of radio oddity there was. Dead air, foreign broadcasts bleeding through, those late-night conspiracy shows that make you question reality. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that stretch of Highway 29 through Missouri, where the cornfields seem to swallow sound and the AM stations drift in and out like whispers from another dimension. It was 3:17 in the morning when I first noticed something wasn't right. I remember the exact time because I just checked my logbook, calculating how many hours I had left before my mandatory rest break. The rain had been coming down steady for the past hour, not heavy enough to slow me down, but persistent enough to turn the world outside my windshield into a blur of red taillights and yellow highway markers. My Peterbilt was running smooth, the diesel engine humming its familiar lullaby, and I had the CB turned low, catching occasional chatter from other drivers still pushing through the night. The radio had been cycling through the usual late-night programming. A talk show host discussing UFO sightings, some static-heavy classic rock, and what sounded like a Spanish language station that kept fading in and out. I was reaching for the tuning knob, trying to find something clearer, when my own voice came through the speakers. Not similar to my voice, not someone who sounded like me, but unmistakably and possibly my actual voice saying words I had never spoken. "The rain's getting heavier now," the radio version of me said, and I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The rain hadn't changed, still that same steady drizzle, but as the words faded into static, I glanced up at the windshield and watched the droplets begin to fall harder against the glass. My wipers, which had been keeping perfect time, suddenly seemed inadequate against the increasing downpour. I told myself it was coincidence, maybe some kind of weird echo from a CB transmission, but the knot forming in my stomach suggested otherwise. The highway stretched ahead, empty except for the occasional pair of headlights in the distance, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror more frequently than usual. The radio crackled back to life, cutting through a commercial for farm equipment with that same impossible voice, my voice, speaking words that made my blood run cold. "There's something following me," Radio Marcus said, the tone casual but carrying an undercurrent of unease that I recognized because I was feeling it myself. Can't quite make it out in the mirrors, but it's there. My eyes shot to the side mirrors, scanning the darkness behind my trailer. Nothing but empty road and the distant glow of some small town's lights reflected off the low clouds. But even as I looked, I became aware of a presence, something just beyond the reach of my taillights that seemed to be pacing my truck. Not another vehicle, nothing I could identify, just a sense of being observed, being followed by something that shouldn't exist. The radio static grew thicker, like interference building up before a storm. And when my voice emerged again, it sounded different, more urgent. It's getting closer now. I can feel it pressing against the back of the trailer, testing the doors. The word sent a shiver down my spine because I could feel it too. An inexplicable pressure against the rear of my rig, as if something massive was nudging against the cargo doors. I pressed the accelerator harder, watching my speedometer climb past the limit. But the presence kept pace effortlessly. The radio continued its impossible commentary. describing my actions before I made them, predicting my thoughts with disturbing accuracy. "I'm going to try the next exit," Radio Marcus announced. And even though I hadn't consciously made that decision, I found my right turn signal already blinking, my eyes already searching for the familiar green sign that would mark my escape route. Exit 127 materialized out of the rain like it had been waiting for me. A single off-ramp leading to what looked like an abandoned truck stop. The radio version of myself was providing play-by-play commentary now, describing the cracked pavement, the flickering neon sign that spelled out letters I couldn't quite read through the rain, the way the shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. Everything he said proved accurate, down to the number of parking spaces in the empty lot and the sound my air brakes made as I brought the rig to a stop. "The engine's still running," Radio Marcus observed, and I realized I hadn't turned it off. Hadn't even thought about it. My hands were frozen on the wheel, and the diesel continued its steady rumble beneath me. "But it's quiet out here. Too quiet for a place this close to the highway." He was right about that, too. The usual sounds of the road, the distant hum of traffic, the whistle of wind through power lines, all of it had vanished, leaving only the rain drumming against my cab and the hypnotic idle of my engine. The radio static shifted, took on an almost conversational quality. "I should check the cargo," my voice said, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to do exactly that, to climb down from the cab and walk back to the trailer doors, even though every instinct I possessed screamed against it. The manifest says electronics, but it feels heavier than it should be. Heavier and somehow more alive. I hadn't looked at the manifest since pickup, but now I remembered the weight discrepancy, how the load had seemed to shift during turns in a way that electronic equipment shouldn't. The Radio Marcus was describing walking toward the back of the trailer, his footsteps echoing strangely in the empty lot, and I could hear those same footsteps outside my cab, feel them vibrating through the frame of my truck. "The locks are different," the radio continued, my voice taking on a note of confusion and growing fear. "These aren't the seals I remember. These are older, made of metal I don't recognize, and they're warm to the touch despite the cold rain." I looked down at my own hands and saw that they were reaching for the door handle, moving without my conscious command. The compulsion to mirror the radio's narrative was becoming irresistible, as if my actions were being scripted by whatever force had captured my voice. The static grew louder, more aggressive, and underneath it I could hear something else. A rhythmic sound like breathing or like waves against a distant shore. Radio Marcus was describing opening the trailer doors, and I felt my feet hitting the wet pavement outside my cab. Felt the cold rain soaking through my jacket as I walked toward the back of my rig. The breathing sound from the radio matched my own accelerated heartbeat, and I realized that whatever was broadcasting my voice wasn't just predicting my actions. It was controlling them. "The cargo isn't electronics," my voice whispered through the static, and I found myself standing before the trailer doors, hands moving toward those strange warm locks. "It's something that's been waiting for someone to let it out, something that's been calling to drivers on this route, using our own voices to guide us home." The locks clicked open under my fingers, and I felt a presence stirring inside the trailer, something vast and patient that had been counting on this moment. The radio crackled once more, and this time when my voice spoke, it was coming from inside the trailer as well as from the speakers in my cab. "Thank you, Marcus," both versions said in perfect unison. "We've been waiting so long for someone to hear our call." The trailer doors began to swing open, and in that moment of terrible understanding, I realized that the radio hadn't been repeating my voice at all. It had been teaching me to repeat theirs. I ran then, abandoning everything, leaving my truck idling in that empty lot as I sprinted through the rain toward the highway. Behind me, I could hear other voices joining the chorus, other drivers who had stopped at this same place, guided by the sound of their own voices speaking words they had never said. The radio in my abandoned cab continued broadcasting, but now it was using a different voice, some other driver who would hear himself speaking. impossible words and feel compelled to follow their guidance. I caught a ride back to civilization with a state trooper who found me walking along the highway shoulder, soaked and incoherent. He told me they'd investigate, but when they went to check coordinates I gave them, they found nothing but empty farmland. No truck stop, no exit 127, no trace of my rig or cargo. Just cornfields stretching to the horizon and a radio tower I swear wasn't there before. Its red beacon pulsing rhythmically against the gray dawn sky. Sometimes, when I'm driving rental trucks on routes far from Missouri, I still catch fragments of my own voice on the AM dial, calling to other drivers, guiding them toward exits that shouldn't exist. The Breathing Highway, from Marcus Hawley. The first time I saw that trailer, it was exhaling smoke like a sleeping dragon in the pale dawn light of a Nebraska truck stop. I'd been driving long haul for 17 years, seen every kind of rig imaginable rolling down America's arteries of asphalt, but nothing quite like the sight of that 40-foot semi-trailer, gently puffing wisps of gray smoke from what looked like invisible pores along its aluminum skin. Not from the exhaust pipes, mind you. Those were cold and silent. The smoke was seeping through the trailer walls themselves, rising in lazy spirals that caught the orange glow of the sodium lights before dissolving into the pre-dawn darkness. I was nursing my third cup of coffee in the cab of my Peterbilt, watching the strange phenomenon through my rain-streaked windshield. While waiting for my mandatory rest period to expire, the trailer sat alone on the far edge of the lot, disconnected from any tractor, looking abandoned except for those gentle exhalations that made it seem almost alive. The smoke wasn't thick or alarming, just persistent threads of gray vapor that emerged in a rhythmic pattern, almost like breathing. Every few seconds, another soft puff would emerge from a different section of the trailer's surface, creating an oddly hypnotic display that held my attention far longer than it should have. The morning dispatcher, a weathered woman named Betty, who'd been working truck stops since the Carter administration, noticed me staring when I went in to grab another coffee and settle my fuel bill. She followed my gaze through the grimy window and let out a low whistle that seemed to carry more unease than admiration. "Been sitting there 4 days now," she said, her voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who'd smoked too many cigarettes during too many lonely nights. "Owner never came back for it. State police ran the plates yesterday. Came up registered to some company that went out of business in 1987. Weird thing is, the registration's still current, paid up through next year." I asked her about the smoke, trying to keep my tone casual despite the strange fascination that had been growing in my chest like a seed taking root. Betty's weathered face creased into deeper lines as she shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the trailer. "Environmental boys came out Tuesday, tested the air all around it, said the smoke's just water vapor, perfectly harmless, but they couldn't explain where it's coming from or why it keeps happening. No heating elements inside, no chemical reactions they can detect. Temperature gauge shows the inside's actually cooler than the outside air." The highway called me west toward Denver, but something about that breathing trailer had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. Mile after mile of cornfields and wheat plains rolled past my windows, but I kept thinking about those gentle exhalations, the way they seemed to follow a pattern almost too regular to be natural. By the time I reached my delivery point in Colorado, I'd already made up my mind to swing back through that same truck stop on my return trip, even though it meant adding an extra 100 miles to my route. 3 days later, under a star-drunk sky that seemed to press down on the plains like a heavy blanket, I pulled back into that same lot. The trailer was still there, still breathing its mysterious smoke into the night air, but now there were differences that made my skin prickle with an undefined unease. The vapor seemed denser somehow, more purposeful, and the rhythm had changed. Instead of the gentle, regular puffs I'd observed before, the smoke now emerged in what almost looked like sighs, longer exhalations that hung in the still air before slowly dissipating. Betty was gone for the night, replaced by a young kid who barely looked old enough to drive, much less work nights at a truck stop. When I asked him about the trailer, he just shrugged with the indifference of youth and mumbled something about how it creeped him out, but wasn't his problem. The lot was nearly empty except for my rig and two others parked near the main building, their drivers probably catching sleep before the morning push. That left me alone with my growing curiosity and the breathing trailer that seemed to be calling to me across the expanse of cracked asphalt. I told myself I was just going to take a closer look, satisfy my professional curiosity about what might be causing such an unusual phenomenon. The walk across the lot felt longer than it should have, my boots echoing against the pavement in a rhythm that seemed to match the trailer's exhalations. Up close, the mystery deepened rather than resolved. The aluminum skin showed no visible openings, no vents or gaps that might explain the smoke's emergence. My flashlight beam revealed a perfectly ordinary trailer exterior, except for the way the vapor seemed to materialize directly from the solid metal surface, like morning mist rising from a lake. The rear doors were secured with a standard lock, nothing fancy, the kind I could probably pick with the tools in my roadside kit if I were so inclined. The thought surprised me with its intensity. I'd never considered myself the type to go poking around in other people's property, but something about this trailer demanded investigation. The smoke continued its rhythmic emergence as I stood there, each puff seeming to whisper secrets just beyond the edge of hearing. When I placed my ear against the cool metal, I could swear I heard something like a heartbeat, slow and steady, coming from somewhere deep inside. Against my better judgment, I retrieved my tools from the Peterbilt and returned to the trailer with hands that trembled slightly in the cool night air. The lock yielded easier than it should have, almost as if it wanted to be opened. The doors swung outward with a soft creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the truck stop lot. Inside, my flashlight beam revealed nothing but empty space and shadows. A perfectly ordinary cargo area with ribbed metal walls and a wooden floor worn smooth by countless loads. But the breathing was stronger here, more pronounced, and I could see where the smoke was emerging from tiny pores in the metal walls that hadn't been visible from outside. The vapor rose from these microscopic openings like breath in winter air, creating shifting patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their formation. The temperature inside was indeed cooler than the outside air, cool enough that I could see my own breath mingling with whatever the trailer was exhaling into the night. I stepped inside, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist, and immediately felt a change in the air pressure around me. It was subtle at first, like the feeling you get before a thunderstorm when the atmosphere itself seems to hold its breath in anticipation. The trailer's exhalations grew more frequent, the vapor thicker until I was standing in a gray fog that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. My flashlight beam scattered and diffused through the mist, creating strange shadows that moved independently of anything that should be casting them. That's when I heard the whisper. So faint it might have been the wind, except there was no wind in the enclosed space. Words in a language I didn't recognize, spoken with the cadence of prayer or incantation, seeming to emerge from the walls themselves. The smoke began to swirl around me in patterns that defied the still air, forming shapes that almost looked like faces before dissolving and reforming into new configurations. The whispers grew clearer, more insistent, and I realized with a growing sense of dread that they weren't coming from outside the trailer, but from somewhere much closer. The breathing sound intensified, no longer the gentle exhalations I'd observed from a distance, but deep, labored gasps as if something massive was struggling for air. The metal walls began to flex slightly, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the breathing, and I could feel the floor beneath my feet rising and falling like the chest of some enormous sleeping creature. The whispers multiplied, voices layering upon voices until they became a chorus of the desperate and the lost, all asking the same question in that unknown tongue. Panic finally overrode curiosity as I realized the trailer doors had swung shut behind me, sealing me inside with whatever presence inhabited this breathing metal shell. I lunged toward where the exit should be, but the smoke had grown so thick I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. The whispers followed me, growing more urgent, more demanding, and I could feel something moving in the vapor around me. Shapes that brushed against my arms and face with touches like cold velvet. My hands found the doors just as the breathing reached a crescendo that made the entire trailer shudder and groan. I threw my weight against the exit, feeling the metal give way, and tumbled out onto the asphalt in a cloud of vapor that dissipated quickly in the open air. Behind me, the trailer fell silent. Its breathing stopped as abruptly as if I'd awakened it from a dream. The sudden quiet was almost more unsettling than the supernatural activity had been. I didn't stop to collect my tools or investigate further. Something primitive in my brain was screaming at me to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I'd encountered in that breathing shell of metal and shadows. The Tuesday That Never Was, from Marcus Rivera. The dashboard clock glowed a steady green against the darkness of Interstate 40, reading 11:47 p.m. as I guided my Peterbilt through the gentle curves of eastern Tennessee. Rain had been my companion for the last 100 miles. A steady percussion against the windshield that mixed with the deep rumble of the diesel engine beneath me. The wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, clearing away the droplets just long enough for me to glimpse the yellow lines disappearing under my headlights before the glass blurred again with fresh moisture. I'd been running this route between Memphis and Knoxville for 3 years now, hauling electronics for a distribution company that paid decent money for overnight deliveries. The roads had become as familiar as the hallways of my own home, every exit and truck stop memorized through countless repetitions. Tonight felt no different than any other Tuesday night run, the kind of routine journey that let my mind wander while my hand steered automatically through the darkness. The dash cam mounted just above my rearview mirror had been recording faithfully for months now, a small insurance against the endless parade of four-wheelers who seemed determined to test the laws of physics around 18-wheelers. I'd installed it after a close call with a sedan that had decided my following distance was really just a suggestion, and while I'd never needed the footage for anything serious, it gave me peace of mind knowing every mile was documented. As the miles rolled by, I found myself thinking about Sarah, my daughter who'd just started her sophomore year at UT. We'd talked earlier that evening before I'd left the terminal, her voice bright with excitement about some project she was working on for her journalism class. She'd always been curious about my life on the road, asking questions about the places I'd seen and the stories I'd collected during my years behind the wheel. Sometimes I wondered if she romanticized the trucking life a bit too much, seeing adventure where I mostly saw highway markers and fuel stops. The radio crackled with the occasional exchange between drivers. Reports of construction zones and speed traps passed along in the informal network that connected us all across the interstate system. Channel 19 carried the usual mix of professional updates and midnight philosophy, voices floating through the static from trucks scattered across hundreds of miles of asphalt. I'd contributed my share of reports over the years, warning others about sudden weather changes or accidents ahead, part of the unspoken brotherhood that made the long hauls a little less lonely. Around mile marker 340, I noticed something odd about the dash cam's display. The small LCD screen that showed the current recording parameters had always been easy to ignore. Just another piece of glowing information competing for attention with the speedometer, fuel gauge, and navigation system. But tonight, something about the date stamp caught my eye during a brief moment when the highway straightened and my attention could wander from the road ahead. According to the camera, today was Thursday. I glanced at my logbook, where I'd clearly marked Tuesday's date when I'd started my shift. The truck's navigation system agreed with my logbook, showing Tuesday in small digital letters. Even my phone, charging in the cup holder, displayed Tuesday when I tilted the screen toward me. But the dash cam insisted with electronic certainty that today was Thursday, 2 days ahead of reality. The discrepancy nagged at me like a stone in a boot, small but impossible to ignore. I'd never paid much attention to the camera's date settings, assuming they'd been correct when the technician installed the system. Electronic devices sometimes lost track of time when their batteries died, or during software updates. Nothing unusual about that. I made a mental note to reset the date when I reached my next stop, treating it as just another minor maintenance issue in the endless list of small problems that kept trucks running. But as the miles continued to accumulate, I found myself glancing at that display more frequently, watching the seconds tick by on what the camera believed was a Thursday that hadn't arrived yet. The rain began to lighten, transitioning from the steady downpour to a misty drizzle that seemed to hang in the air rather than fall. My headlights caught the moisture like tiny diamonds suspended in the darkness, creating an ethereal tunnel of light that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came at the Cookeville exit, a truck stop I'd visited hundreds of times over the years. The camera's night vision mode automatically activated as I slowed for the off-ramp, switching to the stark black and white imagery that computers use to see in darkness. Through the viewfinder, I watched myself guide the truck toward the familiar cluster of lights that marked fuel pumps in the all-night diner. But the truck stop that appeared on the camera's display wasn't the one I remembered from Tuesday's trip. The building looked different somehow, newer or perhaps older, with additional structures that shouldn't have existed and familiar landmarks that seemed to have vanished. The parking lot configuration had changed, with truck spaces in locations I knew had been landscaped islands just 2 days before. Even the signs advertising fuel prices and amenities showed different information than what my eyes were seeing through the windshield. I pulled into a parking space and sat for several minutes,
engine idling, comparing what I could see directly with what the camera was recording.
The differences weren't dramatic enough to be obvious, more like someone had taken a familiar photograph and made subtle adjustments that created an unsettling sense of wrongness. A fuel pump that should have been on the left stood on the right in the camera's view. A restaurant sign that I knew advertised 24-hour service showed different hours in the recorded image. The logical part of my mind suggested equipment malfunction, perhaps some glitch in the camera's processing that was overlaying old footage with new recordings. Dash cams were sophisticated devices, but they were still computers, prone to the same mysterious failures that plagued all electronic systems. I'd seen GPS units that insisted on navigating to locations that no longer existed and radio systems that picked up broadcasts from stations hundreds of miles away. Under the right atmospheric conditions, decided to continue my journey, promising myself I'd deal with the malfunctioning camera after completing my delivery. The schedule didn't allow for extended troubleshooting stops, and the electronics distributor in Knoxville expected their shipment before dawn. Professional drivers learned early that minor equipment problems rarely justified breaking commitments to customers, especially when the truck's essential systems were functioning normally. Back on the interstate, the differences between reality and the camera's version of reality began to multiply. Exit signs that I knew by heart appeared in the wrong locations on the recorded footage. Mile markers seemed to jump backward and forward without pattern. Even the guardrails and bridges that marked familiar sections of highway appeared different in the camera's stark digital vision, as if I were traveling through a parallel version of Route 40 that existed only in the electronic memory of the recording device. The rain had stopped completely by the time I reached the plateau, country east of Cookeville, leaving the road surface gleaming wetly under my headlights. The truck's cab had grown warm and comfortable, isolated from the outside world by steel and glass and the constant white noise of the diesel engine. Under normal circumstances, this was the kind of peaceful solitude I'd learned to cherish during my years on the road. Time to think without interruption and watch the country roll by in the darkness. But tonight, the solitude felt different, charged with an undercurrent of uncertainty that made me constantly aware of the small camera recording everything, with its distorted perspective. I began to wonder what other differences existed between the Thursday it was documenting and the Tuesday I was experiencing. Were there other trucks on its version of the highway that I couldn't see? different weather patterns playing out in its electronic reality. The questions multiplied without answers, creating a growing sense of unease that settled in my chest like indigestion. Around 2 a.m., I encountered another driver at a way station, a woman in a Kenworth hauling furniture who'd stopped to check her load securement. We talked briefly about road conditions and weather, the kind of casual conversation that happened thousands of times each night across the trucking network. She mentioned how quiet Tuesday nights had become compared to the chaos of weekend travel, confirming what I already knew about the current day. But when I checked the dash cam footage later, reviewing the recorded conversation while parked at the way station, her truck wasn't there. The camera showed me standing alone in the parking area, appearing to talk to empty air in the flat digital lighting of the night vision mode. My voice carried clearly in the audio, responding to questions that weren't being asked and commenting on observations that no one else had made. In the camera's version of events, I looked like a man having an animated conversation with invisible companions. The implications of that discovery settled over me like cold fog, raising questions I didn't want to consider. If the camera couldn't see other people who were clearly present, what else was it missing or adding to its version of reality? Was I traveling through a Thursday that existed only in digital memory? The cargo that knows my name, from Marcus Chen. The CB radio had been crackling with the usual chatter when I first heard it, somewhere between Des Moines and Omaha on that long stretch of Interstate 80. October rain drummed against my windshield in a steady rhythm that matched the diesel engine's heartbeat, and the wipers swept back and forth like a metronome keeping time with something I couldn't quite place. I'd been driving for Midwest Freight Solutions for 8 years, hauling everything from refrigerated produce to mysterious sealed containers that paid well enough that I didn't ask questions. This particular load was supposed to be electronics equipment, bound for a warehouse in Denver. Nothing unusual about the manifest or the weight distribution. But there was something about this trailer that felt different from the moment I'd hooked up to it at the depot in Chicago. The dispatcher, a thin man named Gerald with nervous hands and eyes that wouldn't quite meet mine, had handed me the paperwork with an odd sort of urgency. The freight was already loaded and sealed, he'd explained, and the customer had specifically requested no stops except for fuel and mandatory rest breaks. The trailer itself looked ordinary enough from the outside, a standard 48-foot dry van with the company's faded blue logo on the sides. But when I'd walked around it during my pre-trip inspection, I'd noticed that the metal seemed to hum with a frequency just below the range of normal hearing, like the way power lines sometimes vibrate in certain weather conditions. It was 3 hours into the haul when I first heard my name whispered through the CB static. I'd been half listening to a conversation between two drivers arguing about truck stop coffee when the voices faded, and in the sudden quiet, clear as if someone were sitting right beside me, came a soft voice saying, "Marcus." I reached for the CB handset, thinking maybe someone was trying to get my attention, but before I could key the mic, the normal chatter resumed and I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The rain was getting heavier and fatigue could play tricks on a driver's ears, especially on a route I'd traveled so many times that the road signs blurred together into a familiar symphony of mile markers and exit numbers. But 20 minutes later, it happened again, and this time there was no mistaking it. The voice came not from the CB radio but from somewhere behind me, from the trailer itself drifting up through the cab like warm air from a heating vent. "Marcus," it said, drawn out and questioning as if whoever was speaking couldn't quite remember how to pronounce the syllables. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a 24-hour place called Pete's Plaza that I'd used dozens of times before, and walked back to check the trailer. The seals were intact, the doors secure, and when I pressed my ear against the cold metal side, I heard nothing but my own heartbeat echoing back. The friendly cashier inside, a middle-aged woman named Dolores who knew most of the regular drivers by name, asked if everything was all right. I must have looked spooked because she poured me a coffee without being asked. and leaned across the counter with the kind of concern that comes from years of dealing with tired truckers at 3 in the morning. I told her I thought I'd heard something from the trailer, maybe loose cargo shifting around, and she nodded with the understanding of someone who'd heard stranger stories from drivers who'd been on the road too long. But as I walked back to my truck, coffee in hand, I heard her pick up the phone behind me and dial a number, speaking in low tones to someone on the other end. Back on the road, I tried to focus on the familiar routine of driving, the comfortable isolation of the cab where I'd spent more hours than in my own apartment back in Milwaukee. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle that turned the highway into a river of reflected headlights and neon, and I found myself thinking about the cargo manifest I'd signed without really reading. Electronics equipment was vague enough to cover a lot of possibilities, and the weight felt right for computer servers or industrial components. But there was something about the way the trailer pulled that seemed off, as if the weight was distributed unevenly or shifting slightly as I took the curves. That's when the voices started in earnest. Not just my name, but conversations that seemed to be happening inside the trailer, muffled by the metal walls, but clear enough that I could make out individual words. They were talking about me, about my route, about where I lived and what I did when I wasn't driving. One voice, elderly and patient, seemed to be explaining my habits to the others, describing how I always stopped at the same truck stops, how I preferred the overnight drives when the roads were empty, how I lived alone in a small apartment with no family to notice if I disappeared for a few days longer than scheduled. I reached for my cell phone to call dispatch, but the screen showed no signal, which was impossible on this stretch of interstate where I'd made hundreds of calls before. The CB radio was nothing but static now, not even the distant conversations from other drivers that usually provided a soundtrack for the lonely hours between cities. It was as if the trailer behind me was creating some kind of interference, blocking out the normal connections that linked me to the rest of the world. The only sounds were the engine, the rain, and those voices from the cargo compartment that seemed to be growing more distinct with each passing mile. By the time I reached the Nebraska border, I could hear them discussing routes and schedules with the casual familiarity of dispatchers planning loads, except they were talking about other drivers, men and women whose names I recognized from the CB chatter and truck stop conversations. They spoke about these drivers in the past tense, as if they were reviewing completed deliveries rather than planning future ones. When they mentioned Eddie Kowalski, who disappeared 6 months ago somewhere between Kansas City and Denver, I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The fuel gauge was approaching a quarter tank, and I knew I'd have to stop soon whether I wanted to or not. But every truck stop I passed seemed wrong somehow, either completely deserted or filled with trucks I didn't recognize, drivers who stood in small groups under the harsh fluorescent lights and watched my rig with expressions I couldn't read from the highway. The voices in the trailer had gone quiet again, but the silence felt expectant, as if they were waiting for me to make a decision that would determine what happened next. I finally pulled into a pilot station outside of North Platte, choosing the fuel island farthest from the building and parking, so I could keep the trailer in sight at all times. As the diesel pumped, I walked around the rig again, checking the seals and trying to peer through the small gaps around the doors. But the trailer's interior was completely dark. The voices had stopped, but I could feel a presence inside, as if dozens of people were standing just on the other side of the metal wall, waiting patiently for me to open the doors and let them out. The receipt printer at the pump was broken, so I had to go inside to pay, leaving the truck for less than 5 minutes. But when I came back out, there were footprints in the wet asphalt around the trailer, dozens of them, all different sizes and boot types, as if a crowd of people had been walking circles around the cargo compartment. The seals were still intact, but one of the door handles had been turned, and there were handprints on the metal where someone had been pressing against the interior walls. I climbed back into the cab and fired up the engine, but before I could put the truck in gear, my name echoed from the trailer again. this time spoken in chorus by what sounded like dozens of voices, all slightly out of sync like a recording played on equipment that wasn't quite calibrated properly. "Marcus," they said, and then again, "Marcus," each repetition a little louder and more insistent. They weren't just saying my name anymore, but calling to me, as if they wanted me to come back and join them in whatever space they occupied behind those sealed doors. I drove through the rest of the night with the CB turned off and the radio silent, listening to the voices plan and scheme and discuss routes I'd never driven to destinations that didn't appear on any map I'd ever seen. They knew about my apartment, about the spare key I kept under the flower pot, about the bills stacked on my kitchen table, and the photograph of my ex-wife that I still kept in my wallet. They spoke about these things with the casual intimacy of old friends, as if they'd been watching me for years, learning my routines and habits, preparing for this moment when I would deliver them to wherever they needed to go. Dawn was breaking over the Colorado plains when I finally reached the warehouse address on the manifest, but the building was abandoned, windows boarded up and weeds growing through cracks in the loading dock. There was no one to receive the delivery, no one to sign the paperwork or break the seals on the trailer doors. I sat in the cab for an hour, engine idling, while the voices behind me grew more excited, discussing plans and possibilities in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. When I finally drove away from the empty warehouse, I didn't head back toward the interstate. The Phantom Treads. From Marcus Chen. I've been driving the midnight circuit between Phoenix and Tucson for 8 years now, hauling electronics and auto parts down Interstate 10 when the desert sleeps and the highway belongs to us night riders. My Peterbilt 379 has never let me down, her chrome gleaming under truck stop lights and her Caterpillar engine purring like a content beast through Arizona's long stretches of nothing. But what I saw 3 weeks ago out there in the Sonoran darkness has me questioning everything I thought I knew about what travels these roads after sunset. The night started ordinary enough, with me pulling out of Phoenix Sky Harbor's cargo terminal around 11:30, my trailer loaded with computer components bound for a warehouse in South Tucson. The weather was perfect for driving, clear and cool for October, with just enough breeze to keep the cab comfortable without running the air conditioning. I had my usual thermos of black coffee, a bag of sunflower seeds, and a playlist of classic country, keeping me company as I merged onto the interstate and settled into the rhythm that only long-haul truckers understand. The traffic thinned out quickly once I passed the Phoenix city limits, leaving me with just the occasional passenger car and the steady company of other commercial vehicles making their nocturnal runs. There's something peaceful about driving through the desert at night, when the landscape becomes an endless canvas of shadow and starlight, broken only by the sweep of your headlights across saguaro cacti, standing like ancient sentinels in the darkness. The CB radio chattered softly with trucker conversation, weather updates, and bear reports, creating a comforting backdrop of human connection across the vast emptiness. I was about 40 miles south of Phoenix, cruising at a steady 65 through a particularly desolate stretch where the desert extends unbroken to the horizon on both sides. When I first noticed the tire in my mirrors, it appeared suddenly in the glow of my taillights, rolling along the shoulder perhaps 50 feet behind me, keeping perfect pace with my rig. At first glance, it looked like any blown truck tire that had separated from its wheel, the kind of road debris you see occasionally when someone has a blowout and doesn't stop to clean up properly. But something about its movement struck me as odd, too controlled and deliberate for a piece of abandoned rubber bouncing along the asphalt. I eased off the throttle slightly, expecting the tire to roll past me and continue down the highway, but instead it maintained its distance, matching my speed with uncanny precision. When I accelerated back to cruising speed, it accelerated too, staying exactly 50 feet behind my trailer like it was connected by an invisible tether. The tire appeared to be a standard truck tire, probably a 22.5 like the ones on my own rig. But in the red glow of my taillights, it was difficult to make out specific details or determine its exact condition. I reached for my CB radio and keyed the mic, calling out to any drivers who might be monitoring Channel 19. Breaker 19, this is Desert Eagle southbound at mile marker 168. Anybody else seeing some unusual road debris out here tonight? The radio crackled back with silence for several long seconds before a gravelly voice responded from somewhere ahead of me. Desert Eagle, this is Moondog about 10 miles south of your 20. What kind of debris are you talking about, driver? I glanced in my mirror again, confirming that the tire was still there, still maintaining its impossible pace. I've got what looks like a truck tire rolling along behind me, but it's been keeping up with traffic for the last 5 minutes or so. Figured maybe it came off somebody's rig and built up some momentum. Moondog's voice came back with a chuckle. Sounds like you need more coffee, Desert Eagle. Ain't no tire gonna roll 40 miles an hour without something pushing it along. You sure you don't have a vehicle back there with its lights out? I checked my mirrors more carefully, scanning for any sign of a dark vehicle that might be following me with its headlights turned off. But the highway behind me appeared empty except for that solitary tire. Negative, Moondog, I've got clear visibility for at least a quarter mile back. Nothing but that tire. The radio stayed quiet for a moment before Moondog responded. Well, keep an eye on it, driver. Desert plays tricks on folks sometimes, especially this time of night. You need anything, just holler. For the next 10 miles, I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, watching the tire maintain its steady pursuit. It never wavered from its position, never gained or lost ground, just rolled along the shoulder with mechanical precision. I tried varying my speed more dramatically, slowing to 55 and then accelerating to 70. But the tire adjusted its pace accordingly, as if it were somehow locked onto my vehicle. The sight of it began to create an uncomfortable knot in my stomach, a creeping unease that I couldn't entirely rationalize. As I approached the exit for Picacho Peak, I decided to test my unusual follower by making an unexpected lane change. I signaled and moved from the right lane to the left, watching my mirrors to see how the tire would react. To my amazement, it smoothly adjusted its trajectory, rolling across both lanes to maintain its position behind me in the left lane. The movement was too fluid, too purposeful for an inanimate object bouncing along the pavement. It rolled with the same steady rhythm, but I could swear I detected a slight wobble that suggested it was completely hollow, with no rim or axle at its center. I grabbed my CB again and called out to Moondog, whom I was slowly gaining on. Moondog, this is Desert Eagle again. That tire just changed lanes to follow me, and I'm starting to think we might have a situation out here. This time, Moondog's response came back much more serious. Copy that, Desert Eagle. I'm pulling into the Picacho truck stop in about 2 miles. Why don't you follow me in, and we can take a look at whatever's going on back there. The thought of having another set of eyes on this phenomenon brought me considerable relief, and I acknowledged Moondog's suggestion while maintaining my speed toward the truck stop. But as we approached the exit ramp, something changed about my mysterious follower. The tire began to move closer, closing the 50-foot gap that it had maintained so precisely. In my mirror, I could see it accelerating, rolling faster and faster until it was only 20 feet behind my trailer, then 10 feet. Then close enough that I lost sight of it beneath the rear of my trailer. A metallic tapping sound began to echo through my cab, rhythmic and insistent like something striking the undercarriage of my trailer. The sound grew more pronounced as I began to slow for the truck stop exit, a steady percussion that seemed to match the rotation of whatever was following me. I could feel a slight vibration through the seat, as if something were making contact with my rig, though my trailer tracking and handling remained completely normal. Moondog's truck, a well-maintained Kenworth with distinctive purple and gold stripes, was already parked under the bright sodium lights of the truck stop when I rolled in. I pulled into the adjacent space, my heart racing with anticipation and dread, as I prepared to finally get a clear look at whatever had been pursuing me across the desert. I set my air brakes and grabbed a flashlight from my door pocket before stepping down from the cab, where Moondog was already waiting with his own light in hand. Moondog appeared to be in his 60s, with silver whiskers and the weathered face of a driver who had seen everything the road had to offer over the course of decades. He extended a calloused hand and introduced himself as Dale Morrison, and I could see in his eyes the same combination of curiosity and concern that I was feeling. "All right, son. Let's see what kind of ghost you've been hauling around out there," he said, gesturing toward the rear of my trailer. We walked slowly toward the back of my rig, our flashlights cutting through the harsh shadows cast by the truck stop's lighting. I expected to find the tire pressed against my trailer's rear doors, or perhaps wedged somewhere in the undercarriage. But as we rounded the corner and illuminated the entire back end of my trailer, we found nothing at all. The asphalt was empty, without any sign that anything had been following me across 40 miles of desert highway. Dale scratched his whiskers and played his flashlight beam across the ground in a wide arc, searching for any trace of the tire I had described. "You sure it was back here when you pulled in?" he asked, though his tone suggested he believed my account. I could feel it making contact with the trailer, heard it tapping against the undercarriage all the way to the exit ramp, I replied, kneeling down to examine the rear of my trailer for any signs of impact or contact. That's when Dale's flashlight beam froze on something that made both of us take an involuntary step backward. The Sirens Highway from Marcus Holloway. The wind started pulling at my ears when I crossed the Nevada state line, somewhere around 2 in the morning on a Tuesday that felt like it had been stretched thin as piano wire. I'd been running freight from Portland to Phoenix for the better part of 15 years. Knew every truck stop and way station between the Columbia River and the Sonoran Desert, but this particular stretch of Interstate 80 had always made me uneasy. Not because of the terrain or the traffic, mind you, but because of the way the wind moved differently here, like it had intentions all its own. My rig was a 2019 Peterbilt 579, midnight blue with chrome that caught the moonlight just right, and she hummed along the asphalt with the steady rhythm that had lulled me through countless nights on the road. The cargo was nothing special, just electronics bound for distribution centers down south, but the weight felt good behind me, familiar and reassuring. The dashboard lights cast their green glow across my hands on the wheel, and the radio played soft country music that mixed with the engine's drone to create that hypnotic symphony every long-haul driver knows by heart. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the wind wasn't content to simply rush past my windows or buffet the trailer from the side. Tonight, it seemed to be reaching for me specifically, finding ways through the sealed cab that shouldn't have been possible, cool fingers of air that tugged at my earlobes with an almost playful persistence. At first, I attributed it to a loose weather seal, or maybe a small crack in the windshield I hadn't noticed, the kind of minor mechanical issue that announces itself on the highway when everything else is quiet. I reached up and touched my left ear, feeling nothing unusual, just the familiar weight of the small silver stud my daughter had convinced me to get for my 50th birthday 3 years ago. The pulling sensation continued. Not painful exactly, but insistent, like someone gently trying to get my attention by tugging on my sleeve. I adjusted the air conditioning, thinking maybe the circulation system was creating some kind of pressure differential, but the pulling only grew stronger, more focused, as if the wind had found exactly what it was looking for. The highway stretched empty in both directions, a ribbon of black asphalt bordered by sagebrush, and the occasional cluster of Joshua trees that stood like sentinels in the desert darkness. No other headlights were visible, which wasn't unusual for this time of night on this particular stretch, but the isolation felt more pronounced somehow, as if I'd crossed into some space between destinations where the normal rules didn't quite apply. The stars overhead were brilliant and cold, offering no comfort, just serving as witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. I tried changing the radio station, thinking maybe some talk radio would ground me in normalcy, but as I reached for the dial, the wind pulled harder at my ears, causing me to jerk my hand back involuntarily. The sensation wasn't painful, but it was impossible to ignore. like having someone whisper your name from just outside your field of vision. I shook my head, trying to clear whatever fog was settling over my thoughts, and pressed down a little harder on the accelerator, eager to put this strange stretch of highway behind me. That's when I noticed the sound threading through the wind noise. So subtle at first that I thought it might be interference from a distant radio station bleeding through. It was musical, almost melodic, a series of notes that rose and fell with the gusts buffeting my truck. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, the kind of tune that seems familiar even when you're certain you've never heard it before. And despite my growing unease, I found myself straining to hear it more clearly. The pulling at my ears intensified as if the wind wanted to draw me closer to the source of that ethereal music. I glanced at my GPS display, noting that I was still about 40 miles from the next town, a small place called Harmony Creek that consisted of little more than a truck stop, a diner, and a handful of houses clustered around a single main street. The device showed my location as a steady blue dot moving along the red line of the interstate. Everything normal and accounted for, but the landscape outside my windows seemed to be shifting in subtle ways that my instruments couldn't measure or record. The music grew clearer as the miles passed, revealing itself to be a song without words, carried on currents of air that shouldn't have been able to penetrate my well-sealed cab. It was the kind of melody that spoke directly to something deep in your chest, bypassing your ears and resonating in your bones like the memory of a lullaby your mother might have sung when you were too young to remember the words. The wind continued its gentle but insistent tugging, and I realized with a growing sense of alarm that it was pulling my ears in a specific direction, trying to turn my head toward the passenger side window. I resisted the urge to look, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead, but the compulsion was growing stronger with each passing mile. The music swirled around me now, complex harmonies that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, and the wind's touch had evolved from a gentle tug to something more like a caress, cool fingers tracing the curve of my ears with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white in the dashboard light, as I fought the increasingly powerful urge to pull over and step outside to find the source of that beautiful, terrible song. The landscape outside had definitely changed, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly how. The desert scrub seemed thicker, more lush, and the occasional rock formations had taken on shapes that suggested faces or reaching hands in the moonlight. The asphalt beneath my wheels felt the same. The yellow lines continued their steady march toward the horizon, but everything else had acquired a dreamlike quality that made me question whether I was still traveling through the same Nevada I'd crossed countless times before. I tried rolling up my windows, even though they were already closed and the wind laughed at my futile gesture, finding new ways to reach me through vents and gaps I hadn't known existed. The music was getting louder now, or maybe closer, a symphony of voices that sang in harmonies no human throat could produce. The melody wound through my consciousness like smoke, carrying with it images of vast spaces and ancient places, of desert winds that had been singing the same song since before humans first learned to listen. That's when I saw the lights off to my right, distant at first but growing brighter as I approached. They weren't the harsh fluorescence of a truck stop or the warm amber of house windows, but something altogether different. A soft, blue-white radiance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the music filling my cab. The wind pulled harder at my ears, trying to turn my head toward those mysterious lights, and I found my resistance weakening as the song reached a crescendo that made my heart race and my palms sweat. I caught glimpses of the lights from the corner of my eye as I fought to keep my attention on the road. They appeared to be arranged in patterns, geometric shapes that shifted and flowed like constellations come down to earth. The music swelled around me, no longer just a melody, but a full orchestral arrangement that seemed to be building toward some climactic moment, and the wind's touch on my ears had become almost electric, sending shivers down my spine with each gentle tug. The compulsion to stop became overwhelming as I drew nearer to the lights. My foot moved toward the brake pedal almost of its own accord, and I had to consciously force myself to maintain speed, to keep moving past whatever was calling to me from the desert floor. The wind howled now, not with anger, but with something like pleading. And the music reached such beautiful, terrible heights that tears began streaming down my face without my permission. Through sheer force of will, I kept my truck on the highway, speeding past the lights even as every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop, to turn, to answer the call that had been pulling at my ears for the past hour. In my mirrors, I could see the illumination fading behind me, and gradually, the music began to diminish as well, fading back to a whisper, then to silence, leaving only the familiar sounds of engine and road. The wind's touch lingered for several more miles, gentle tugs at my earlobes that felt almost regretful now, like a lover's farewell caress. By the time I reached Harmony Creek, the sensation had faded entirely, leaving me with nothing but the memory of that impossible song, and the certainty that I had narrowly escaped something that would have changed me forever. I pulled into the truck stop, hands shaking as I shut down the engine, and sat in the sudden silence of my cab trying to process what had just happened. The parking lot was empty except for one other rig, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with mundane electricity that seemed almost aggressive after the subtle beauty of those desert illuminations. When I finally climbed down from my cab, the night air was still and normal, carrying only the familiar sense of diesel fuel and cooling asphalt. But as I walked toward the diner for coffee and the comfort of human company, the 13th station, from Marcus Clay. The thing about driving long haul is that you develop routines, little rituals that keep you sane during those endless stretches of asphalt and yellow lines. Me, I've been running freight for 23 years, and I know every truck stop between here and the Canadian border like they're rooms in my own house. That's why when I pulled into what looked like Jerry's fill-up outside Bakersfield on that foggy October night, something felt wrong from the moment I set the air brakes. The station looked right mostly. Same faded red and white sign, same two diesel pumps standing like metal sentries under the flickering fluorescent canopy. But Jerry's fuel cap on my Peterbilt had always closed with a satisfying metallic click, never making more sound than that. Tonight, when I twisted it shut after topping off the tank, it let out a sound like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard, high and thin and lasting far longer than it should have. I stood there in the diesel fumes and October chill, staring at that fuel cap like it might explain itself. The screech seemed to hang in the air even after it stopped, making my teeth ache and the hair on my forearms stand up. In 23 years of trucking, through mechanical failures and tire blowouts and every kind of road trouble you can imagine, I'd never heard my truck make a sound like that. The fog was rolling in thick from the west, turning the fluorescent lights into pale halos and making the edges of everything soft and uncertain. I could barely make out the convenience store through the mist, its windows glowing amber like tired eyes. The whole place had an abandoned quality despite the lights being on, like a movie set after the cameras stopped rolling. I tried to shake off the unease as I walked toward the store to pay for the fuel. The glass door opened with its familiar electronic chime, and I stepped into the warmth and harsh lighting of the interior. The clerk behind the counter was someone I didn't recognize, which was odd since Jerry had run this place with the same 3 employees for as long as I'd been stopping here. This guy was pale and thin with dark circles under his eyes and an expression that seemed to look right through me. "Pump 2, I said, pulling out my wallet. "Diesel." He nodded without speaking and rang up the sale. His fingers moved over the register keys with mechanical precision, but his eyes never quite focused on me or the screen or anything else I could identify. When he handed me the receipt, his skin was cold as winter metal. Back outside, the fog had thickened even more, reducing visibility to maybe 15 feet. My truck sat in the diesel island like a sleeping giant, its chrome bumper and exhaust stacks disappearing into the gray void above. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, casting everything in an unstable, strobing glow that made shadows dance at the edge of my vision. I did my standard post-fuel routine, checking my load straps and walking around the rig for a visual inspection. Everything looked normal, but that screech from the fuel cap kept echoing in my head. It had sounded almost organic, like something alive and in pain. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that it wasn't a mechanical sound at all. The fog pressed close as I climbed back into the cab, settling into the worn leather seat that had shaped itself to my body over countless miles. I fired up the Caterpillar engine, and it rumbled to life with its familiar diesel growl, a sound that usually comforted. The CB radio crackled with static as I pulled away from the pump, and I caught fragments of conversation from other drivers somewhere out in the night, but their voices sounded strange, distorted by the fog or distance or something else I couldn't name. Words came through clearly for a moment, then dissolved into white noise, like tuning through stations on an old AM radio. Highway 58 stretched ahead into the fog bank, the yellow center line disappearing after maybe 20 feet. I kept my speed down and my eyes fixed on what little road I could see. The diesel engine settling into its highway rhythm. The heater fan whispered warm air across my boots, and the dashboard lights created a small circle of familiar comfort in the vast uncertainty outside. But something was wrong with the fuel gauge. I'd just filled up, topped off the tank completely, but the needle sat just below the full mark. Not dramatically low, but definitely not where it should be after a complete fill-up. I tapped the gauge with one finger, thinking it might be stuck, but the needle didn't move. Miles clicked by on the odometer as the fog began to thin, revealing glimpses of the familiar landscape along this stretch of highway. The fuel gauge continued its slow, steady descent, the needle dropping far faster than it should even under a full load. By the time I'd traveled 30 miles from the truck stop, it read 3/4 full. 50 miles out, it showed half a tank. I pulled over at the next exit, a deserted off-ramp that led to nothing but dark farmland and a single streetlight casting a pale circle on empty asphalt. The engine ticked and cooled as I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down to check the fuel tank. No visible leaks, no puddles on the pavement, no smell of diesel beyond the normal residual odors that cling to any long-haul rig. The fuel cap looked normal in the flashlight beam, chrome and black rubber sealing ring, exactly as it had for the past 4 years. But when I unscrewed it to check the fuel level, that sound came again. The screech rose from the fuel tank opening like something escaping, high and sustained and somehow desperate. It lasted until I stopped turning the cap, then cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of wind across the empty fields and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. I aimed the flashlight down into the tank, expecting to see diesel fuel sloshing maybe 6 inches below the opening. Instead, the light beam disappeared into what looked like complete darkness, as if the tank had no bottom or the fuel had turned black as crude oil. When I dropped a coin into the opening, I never heard it hit liquid or metal. My hands were shaking as I screwed the cap back on, and the screech came again, longer this time and with what sounded like harmonics, like multiple voices calling from somewhere far below. The sound seemed to vibrate through the truck frame and up into my bones, making my vision blur and my stomach lurch with sudden nausea. I climbed back into the cab and fired up the engine, pulling onto the highway with the fuel gauge now reading just above empty, despite having driven less than 60 miles since filling up. The diesel engine ran smooth as ever, giving no indication of fuel problems. But the gauge needle continued its relentless descent toward the red zone. The next truck stop was 18 miles ahead according to my GPS, a 24-hour facility I'd used dozens of times before. I nursed the throttle and watched the fuel gauge like a hawk, calculating whether I'd make it or end up stranded on the shoulder with an empty tank and a load of auto parts that had to be in Phoenix by morning. 15 miles from the truck stop, the fuel gauge hit empty. 14 miles and the low fuel warning light came on. 13 miles and the engine began to surge slightly, the way diesels do when they start sucking air instead of fuel. But somehow, impossibly, the motor kept running. pulling the 40-ton load through the night as if nothing were wrong. The truck stop appeared through the darkness ahead, its bright lights and familiar corporate logos like a beacon of salvation. I coasted into the diesel island and shut down the engine, my heart pounding and my shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. The place looked completely normal, clean and well lit and busy with the usual mix of long-haul drivers and local traffic. I climbed down and approached the fuel pump with hands that still trembled slightly. The pump handle felt solid and real. The diesel flowed with its normal gurgling sound, and the electronic display counted off gallons and dollars in reassuring digital precision. When the tank was full, the pump clicked off exactly where it should, and I screwed the fuel cap back on with no sound except the normal metallic threading. Inside the truck stop, the clerk was a cheerful middle-aged woman I'd seen dozens of times before. She rang up my fuel purchase with the same small talk about weather and road conditions, treating me like any other customer on any other night. The receipt showed exactly what I'd expect for a full fill-up. Nothing unusual or impossible about the numbers. But when I walked back outside, the fog was rolling in again, thick and gray and somehow deliberate in the way it flowed around the buildings and parking areas. My truck sat where I'd left it, chrome gleaming under the harsh lights, looking exactly like the reliable machine it had been for 4 years and 800,000 miles. I fired up the engine and pulled back onto the highway, the fuel gauge reading full and steady. The basement radio, from Jake Morrison. The CB radio started picking up that voice again somewhere outside Flagstaff, crackling through the static like a whisper from underground. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling freight between Phoenix and Denver, and I thought I knew every trucker, every dispatcher, every late-night DJ who broadcast along this stretch of desert highway. But this voice was different. It sounded muffled, distant, like someone calling up from the bottom of a well. My Kenworth hummed steadily through the darkness, headlights cutting through the cool October air. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, broken only by the occasional cluster of lights marking some forgotten town. I'd been on the road for 8 hours straight, fighting off drowsiness with black coffee and the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. The CB had been quiet most of the night, just the usual chatter between drivers warning about speed traps and road construction. Then around 2 in the morning, that voice broke through. At first, I couldn't make out the words. The transmission quality was poor, filled with a strange echo that made it sound like the speaker was trapped in some enclosed space. I adjusted the squelch, fine-tuned the channel, but the distortion remained. The voice seemed to be reading numbers, long sequences that meant nothing to me. Coordinates maybe, or some kind of code. There was something unsettling about the monotone delivery. The way each digit was pronounced with mechanical precision. Breaker 19, this is Desert Dog. I called into the handset using my handle. Got someone on the channel reading numbers, you copy? No response came back, just the continued recitation of digits punctuated by bursts of static. I tried switching channels, but the voice followed me, always there in the background like an unwanted passenger. The highway curved through a series of low hills, and I noticed a truck stop ahead, its neon sign flickering against the star-filled sky. The Cactus Inn, a place I'd stopped at countless times over the years. I decided to pull in, stretch my legs, maybe grab another coffee and see if any other drivers were hearing the same transmission. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of semis sitting dark and silent near the back fence. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light. The clerk behind the counter looked up from his magazine, a thin man with tired eyes who'd been working nights here longer than I'd been driving. "Evening, Jake," he said, recognizing me. "Little early for your usual stop, isn't it?" "Couldn't sleep if I tried," I said, pouring coffee from the pot that had probably been brewing since sunset. "You get any weird radio transmissions out here? CB stuff that doesn't make sense?" The clerk shook his head, looking puzzled. "Can't say I have." Most drivers keep to themselves passing through here. Why, you picking up something strange? I described the voice, the endless stream of numbers, the odd quality that made it sound like it was coming from underground. The clerk listened with growing interest, then leaned forward across the counter. You know, there was something like that a few years back. Driver came in here all worked up about voices on his radio. Said they were coming from under the floorboards of his truck. Of course, we all figured he'd been on the road too long, you know how it gets. The coffee tasted bitter in my mouth as I considered this. Every trucker knew about road hypnosis, the way long hours and monotonous highways could play tricks on your mind. But this felt different, more real than any hallucination. What happened to that driver? I asked. The clerk's expression grew uncertain. Never saw him again after that night. Heard his truck was found abandoned up near Gallup, but the man himself just vanished. Probably just moved on to a different route. Back in my truck, I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a distant radio tower with technical problems. Maybe some automated system broadcasting test signals. But as I pulled back onto the highway, the voice returned, clearer now than before. I could hear what sounded like breathing between the numbers, long pauses that felt deliberate and purposeful. The transmission seemed to be getting stronger as I drove deeper into the desert. Miles passed in darkness, marked only by the occasional reflector post catching my headlights. The voice continued its endless recitation, and I began to notice a pattern in the numbers. They weren't random. There was a sequence that repeated every few minutes, always the same digits in the same order. I grabbed a pen from my dashboard and started writing them down on a napkin from the truck stop. My handwriting shaky as the truck swayed with the road's gentle curves. That's when I noticed something else. The voice wasn't just coming from the CB anymore. It seemed to be rising from beneath me, as if someone was lying on the ground under my truck, speaking up through the floorboards. The sound had a quality I'd never heard before, muffled and distant, but somehow intimate, like a secret being whispered directly into my ear. I pulled over at a rest area, a small paved lot with a few picnic tables and a broken-down restroom. The isolation hit me immediately. There were no other vehicles in sight, no lights except my own headlights reflecting off a bent stop sign. I left the engine running and climbed down from the cab, walking slowly around my truck with a flashlight. Everything looked normal. The undercarriage was clean, no signs of damage or anything that shouldn't be there. But I could still hear the voice, fainter now but definitely present. It seemed to be coming from the ground itself, as if someone was buried beneath the asphalt trying to communicate with the world above. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the pavement, feeling foolish but unable to resist. The numbers were clearer now, and I realized they weren't coordinates or code. They were dates and times, specific moments stretching back years, maybe decades. Standing up, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert air. The voice was reading a record of something, a log of events that had happened in this exact spot. I looked around the rest area with new eyes, noticing details I'd missed before. The picnic tables were weathered and cracked, their surfaces scarred with old graffiti. The restroom building had been abandoned long enough for weeds to grow through cracks in its foundation. This wasn't an active rest stop. It was a forgotten place somewhere travelers had once paused but no longer remembered. I hurried back to my truck, eager to get back on the road and away from whatever presence I'd stumbled upon. But as I reached for the door handle, the voice changed. Instead of numbers, I heard words, spoken in the same muffled tone but now unmistakably human. "Help me," it said over and over again. "I'm still down here. I'm still waiting." My hands shook as I climbed back into the cab. The voice was coming from inside my truck now, definitely from beneath the floorboards. I could feel vibrations through the pedals as if someone was tapping on the underside of the chassis. The CB radio crackled with static, but underneath the white noise, I could hear what sounded like scratching, like fingernails dragging across metal. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, driving faster than I normally would, eager to put distance between myself and that abandoned rest area. But the voice followed me, Growing stronger with each mile, it began telling me things, details about other drivers who had passed this way, descriptions that were too accurate to be coincidence. It knew about the trucker who'd stopped at the Cactus Inn years earlier, the one who'd vanished near Gallup. It knew about others too, drivers who disappeared along this route, their trucks found empty by the side of the road. The voice explained that it had been calling to them from under the ground, from beneath floors and pavement and asphalt, trying to warn them about something that waited in the darkness ahead, but they hadn't listened, hadn't understood the message hidden in the endless stream of numbers. Now it was trying to reach me, to make me understand before I ended up like the others. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange, the voice began to fade. The numbers returned, but they were different now, more urgent, as if time was running out. I drove through the morning light with a growing sense that I'd been marked somehow, chosen to hear something that others had missed. The highway stretched ahead of me like always, familiar and welcoming in the daylight, but I knew I'd never drive this route the same way again. When I finally reached Denver and pulled into the freight yard, the voice was gone completely. The CB returned to normal, picking up the usual chatter from other drivers starting their day. I completed my delivery and filed my logbook, going through the motions of a routine I'd performed thousands of times before. The numbers game. From Eddie Torino. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours as I made my way through the winding mountain passes of eastern Kentucky, my Peterbilt's diesel engine humming its familiar lullaby against the backdrop of a gentle autumn rain. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, clearing away the droplets that caught the amber glow of my running lights like tiny jewels scattered across the glass. It was well past midnight, and the highways had grown sparse with traffic, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the occasional 18-wheeler heading in the opposite direction, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights probing the depths of some vast, wet cave. I'd been running this road between Louisville and Beckley for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment, and I knew every curve, every grade, every truck stop along the way. The CB had always been my companion on these lonely stretches, connecting me to other drivers who understood the solitude of the long haul, the way the road could stretch out before you like an endless ribbon of possibility and uncertainty. But tonight, something felt different about the usual chatter that filtered through the speakers mounted above my sleeper berth. At first, I thought it was just another driver playing games. Maybe someone bored out of their mind and looking for attention. The voice came through clear enough, though it seemed to drift in and out of the static like a signal from somewhere far away, somewhere the radio waves had to struggle to reach. It was a child's voice, high and sweet, with a kind of innocent cadence that made you think of playgrounds and summer afternoons. Though hearing it at this hour, in this empty stretch of mountain highway, sent an odd chill crawling up between my shoulder blades. "One," the voice said, as clear as if the child were sitting right there in my passenger seat. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The counting stopped and the CB fell silent except for the usual background hiss. I adjusted the squelch, thinking maybe I'd picked up some interference from a baby monitor or a toy walkie-talkie. The kind of random signals that sometimes bounced around these mountains in strange ways. But as I crested the next hill, my headlights sweeping across the guardrails that separated the roadway from the dark valleys below, the voice returned, starting over with the same patient, methodical counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This time I keyed the microphone, my thumb pressing down on the worn button that had seen thousands of conversations over the years. Breaker 19, this is Road Dog Eddie eastbound on 64. Got a little one on the radio there. Might want to check your squelch. I waited for a response, watching the green LED on the radio face flicker as other transmissions whispered past, but no one answered. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the cab, and the engine maintained its steady rumble, but the CB had gone quiet again. leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the rhythmic sweep of the wipers. Miles passed, and I found myself glancing at the radio more often than usual, waiting for the voice to return. The mountain highway curved and climbed, descending into valleys where fog hung like gossamer between the trees, then rising again toward peaks that disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. My CB picked up the occasional transmission from other drivers, the usual reports about speed traps and weather conditions. But underneath it all, I kept listening for that small voice, that innocent counting that had somehow lodged itself in my mind like a song you can't shake. When it came again, I was ready for it, my hand already reaching for the microphone before the first number left the child's lips. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The voice was clearer this time, and I could hear something in the background, a kind of hollow echo that suggested the transmission wasn't coming from a typical CB setup. It sounded more like the child was speaking from inside a large, empty space, maybe a warehouse or an abandoned building. Somewhere the sound could bounce and multiply before reaching the microphone. "Little buddy, this is Road Dog Eddie," I said, keeping my voice gentle and calm. "You shouldn't be on the CB this late at night. Are your folks around?" Again, no response, just the patient return of static and the distant murmur of other conversations filtering through the darkness. But this time, something else caught my attention, a detail that made me ease off the accelerator and lean closer to the radio. In the background of the child's transmission, just barely audible beneath that hollow echo, I thought I could hear the sound of diesel engines, the distinctive rumble of big rigs idling somewhere in the distance. The thought struck me that maybe this wasn't some kid playing with a radio at home. Maybe someone was out here, somewhere along this same stretch of highway, and they had a child with them. Someone too young to understand that the CB wasn't a toy, that truckers use these channels for business and safety. The possibility worried me more than I wanted to admit. Because what kind of child would be awake at this hour, playing with a radio while trucks idled nearby? The scenarios that ran through my mind weren't pleasant ones, and I found myself pressing a little harder on the accelerator, suddenly eager to reach the next truck stop where I could ask around, see if anyone else had heard the transmissions. But as the miles rolled beneath my wheels and the rain continued its gentle assault on the windshield, the voice came back again, and this time something in the tone made me realize that this wasn't a game, wasn't some innocent child playing with equipment they didn't understand. There was a purpose to the counting, a deliberate quality that spoke of ritual rather than play. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The words came with the same measured pace, but now I could hear something else underneath them, a kind of expectant quality, as if the child were waiting for something to happen when they reached 10. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the highway ahead curved sharply to the right, following the contour of a mountain slope that dropped away into darkness. The guardrail flashed past in the amber glow of my running lights, and beyond it, nothing but empty air and the distant valley floor. This was one of the more treacherous sections of the route, where drivers had to maintain steady speeds and smooth steering inputs to avoid the kind of accidents that made headlines in the trucking magazines, the sort of disasters that happened when 40 tons of freight met gravity and poor judgment on a rain-slick mountain. Road 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The voice came again just as I entered the curve, and this time I heard something that made my blood run cold. In the pause after 10, before the static returned, there was a sound like rushing wind, like air being sucked through a tunnel or a cave. And underneath that, so faint I almost missed it, the distant sound of squealing brakes and grinding metal. It lasted only a second, maybe two, before the transmission cut out completely, leaving me alone with the rain and the engine and the sudden, overwhelming certainty that whatever was happening here, it wasn't innocent, wasn't random, and it was far from over. I reached for the CB again, this time switching to channel 19, the main trucking frequency, hoping to raise another driver. Someone else who might have heard the transmissions. Breaker 19, this is Road Dog Eddie eastbound on 64. Anybody copy? The response came almost immediately. A gravelly voice with a slight southern drawl that spoke of years on the road and countless nights like this one. Roger that, Road Dog. This is Moondog westbound your direction. What's your 20? Just cleared the big curve at mile marker 215, I replied, checking the green signs that flashed past in my headlights. You been monitoring channel 17 at all tonight? Got some strange transmissions, sounds like a kid counting. There was a pause, long enough that I started to wonder if Moondog had moved out of range. But then his voice came back and something in the tone made me ease off the accelerator again. Yeah, Road Dog, I've been hearing that little voice for maybe an hour now. Thought about calling it in, but figured it was just some kid with a radio, you know? But here's the thing that's got me spooked. Every time that counting stops, I see something up ahead, usually an accident or a breakdown. Something that makes me have to hit the brakes real sudden-like. The chill that had been crawling up my spine suddenly blossomed into full-fledged fear. The kind of cold terror that comes when you realize you're in the middle of something that can't be explained by logic or experience. What kind of accidents? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The backward journey, from Marcus the chrome exhaust stacks of my Peterbilt 379, caught the last amber rays of sunset as I pulled into the rest stop outside Flagstaff, Arizona. 23 years of hauling freight across this country had taught me to trust my instincts, and something about the elderly woman standing beside the vending machines with her weathered thumb extended made me want to keep driving. But the desert wind was picking up, painting the horizon with dust devils, and she looked fragile enough to blow away with the tumbleweeds. I downshifted and brought the big rig to a gentle stop, the air brakes hissing their familiar sigh. Through my passenger window, I could see her more clearly now. She appeared to be in her 70s, maybe 80s, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and deep lines etched around pale blue eyes. Her floral dress looked like something from a different decade, and she carried a small brown suitcase that seemed too heavy for her thin arms. "Where you headed, ma'am?" I called out, leaning across the cab as she approached. "West," she said simply, her voice carrying the tremor of age. "Just west, if you don't mind the company." Her politeness reminded me of my grandmother, and the loneliness in her eyes sealed the deal. I'd been driving solo for the past 8 hours with nothing but talk radio, and the steady rumble of the Caterpillar engine for company. Besides, company policy allowed for passengers, and something told me this old woman had stories worth hearing. She climbed into the cab with surprising agility, settling into the passenger seat with a soft sigh of relief. Up close, I noticed her hands were remarkably smooth, almost delicate, though her face told the story of many decades lived. She introduced herself as Helen, and as we merged back onto Interstate 40, she began to share fragments of her life. She spoke of a husband who'd passed years ago, children scattered across the country, and a deep restlessness that had finally compelled her to leave the nursing home in Albuquerque. The first hour passed pleasantly enough. Helen's voice had a soothing quality that seemed to harmonize with the engine's steady drone. She told me about her younger days, working as a telephone operator in the 1950s, the excitement of connecting calls across vast distances, the satisfaction of helping voices find each other across the darkness. As she spoke, I found myself glancing over at her more frequently, something nagging at the back of my mind like a word on the tip of my tongue. It was when we stopped for fuel in Winslow that I first noticed something odd. As Helen climbed down from the cab to stretch her legs, she moved with a fluidity that seemed inconsistent with her apparent age. Her steps were lighter, more confident than they'd been at the rest stop. I attributed it to the comfort of the ride, maybe some arthritis loosening up, and thought nothing more of it as we continued west into the deepening night. The desert landscape rolled past in endless waves of shadow and starlight. Helen's conversation grew more animated as the miles accumulated behind us. Her voice losing some of its earlier frailty, she began talking about her college years, describing a vitality and passion that seemed to energize her entire being. Her posture straightened gradually, and when she gestured while speaking, her movements became more graceful, more youthful. By the time we reached Holbrook, I was certain something unusual was happening. Under the intermittent glow of passing streetlights, Helen's face appeared less lined, her silver hair showing hints of darker color at the roots. When she smiled, which she did more frequently now, her teeth seemed whiter, more complete than I remembered from our earlier conversations. The unsettling realization crept over me slowly, like fog rolling across a highway, that my passenger was somehow growing younger. I tried to rationalize what I was observing. Perhaps the harsh lighting at the rest stop had been unflattering, or maybe my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. 23 years of night driving had shown me all manner of optical illusions created by headlights, neon signs, and fatigue. But as we continued through the Arizona night, the changes became impossible to ignore or explain away. Helen's voice grew stronger with each passing mile, losing its elderly tremor and gaining a clarity that made her stories more vivid. She spoke now of her teenage years, of high school dances and first loves, and her enthusiasm was infectious. But with each reminiscence, each journey backward through her memories, her physical appearance seemed to follow suit. The lines around her eyes softened, her skin took on a healthier glow, and her movements became increasingly animated. As we approached Winslow, she was describing her childhood with such detail and emotion that it felt as though she was reliving those moments rather than simply remembering them. Her laughter became lighter, more musical, and when she turned to look at me, I saw that her eyes had gained a brightness that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The woman who had struggled with her suitcase at the rest stop was disappearing, replaced by someone who appeared to be in her 60s, then her 50s, as the night progressed. The realization of what was happening should have terrified me, but instead, I found myself mesmerized by the impossible transformation taking place in my passenger seat. Helen seemed unaware of the physical changes, lost as she was in her journey backward through time. She spoke of her wedding day with such joy and immediacy that I could almost see the young bride she had been, and perhaps was becoming again. By the time we reached Flagstaff, Helen appeared to be no older than 40, her silver hair now predominantly brown with only threads of gray remaining. Her floral dress, which had seemed loose and elderly before, now fit her with the confidence of middle age. She was describing her children's births, the miracle of new life, and the overwhelming love she had felt, when I noticed that her voice carried the strength and warmth of a woman in her prime. The highway stretched ahead of us, empty and hypnotic under the star-filled sky. The steady rhythm of tires on asphalt seemed to mark time like a clock running backward, each mile we traveled carrying Helen further into her past. She spoke of her early married years, of dreams and ambitions, of a world that seemed full of infinite possibilities. Her enthusiasm was intoxicating, and I found myself caught up in her stories, almost forgetting the supernatural strangeness of what was occurring. As we passed through the small towns and endless desert, Helen continued to grow younger, her transformation accelerating with each hour. By the time the first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, she appeared to be in her 30s, then her 20s, her face glowing with the beauty and optimism of youth. Her stories had reached her college years, filled with hopes and dreams that stretched ahead of her like an endless highway. It was as we approached the California border that Helen's narrative reached her childhood, and I realized with growing alarm that the process was not slowing down. She spoke of birthday parties and Christmas mornings with the wonder of a child, her voice becoming higher, more innocent with each memory. Her adult dress now hung loose on her diminishing frame, and when she turned to smile at me, I saw in her face the ghost of the little girl she had once been. The sun was rising behind us, painting the desert in shades of gold and red when Helen's voice began to fade. She was speaking now of her earliest memories, fragments of sensation and emotion that seemed to dissolve even as she tried to grasp them. Her form in the passenger seat grew smaller, more insubstantial, like morning mist touched by sunlight. I pulled over at a rest stop near Barstow, my hands shaking as I brought the truck to a stop. When I turned to look at my passenger, Helen was gone. The seat held only a small indentation where she had been sitting, and the faint scent of lilacs that might have been imagination. Her brown suitcase sat on the floor, and when I opened it with trembling fingers, I found it filled with photographs spanning an entire lifetime, from infant to elderly woman, as though someone had carefully documented every stage of a long and full existence. The morning traffic began to build as I sat there in the cab, trying to process what had happened. Had Helen been traveling backward through her life, reliving her memories in reverse until she reached her beginning and simply faded away? Or had I been privileged to witness something else entirely, some cosmic rewinding that allowed a weary soul to return to innocence? I never found any answers that satisfied the logical part of my mind. Missing person reports, hospital inquiries, even a private detective I hired months later all came to nothing. Helen, it seemed, had never existed, or perhaps had existed so completely that she had worn out her welcome in this world and needed to retreat to wherever stories go when they've been fully told. But sometimes, when I'm driving through the desert at night and the miles stretch endlessly ahead, I think I can still hear her voice in the engine's steady rumble, forever young. The trailer that fears the dawn from Marcus Kane. The thing about driving nights on the interstate is that you develop a sense for what belongs and what doesn't. After 15 years hauling freight across the lower 48, I can tell you there's a rhythm to the darkness, a natural order to the way shadows fall across the asphalt and how headlights cut through the black. But that Tuesday night in October, somewhere between Bakersfield and Barstow, I encountered something that violated every rule I thought I understood about the road. I was deadheading back from a furniture delivery, running empty and making good time on the 58 East when I first spotted the trailer in my mirrors. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard 53-footer, the kind you see 1,000 times a week on any major highway. But something about its silhouette felt wrong against the star-scattered sky. The way it sat on its chassis seemed too low, too settled, as if the weight inside had compressed the very metal of its frame. No running lights adorned its length, just a solid black rectangle following about a quarter-mile behind my Peterbilt. The driver of the Kenworth pulling it seemed competent enough, maintaining proper following distance and staying in the right lane like a professional. But as the miles rolled beneath my wheels, I began to notice peculiarities that set my teeth on edge. Whenever we passed beneath the occasional overpass light, or when oncoming traffic swept their high beams across the roadway, that trailer would seem to shiver. Not the normal vibration you'd expect from road irregularities or wind, but an actual trembling as if the metal itself was recoiling from illumination. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of perspective, the way heat waves can make distant objects appear to dance even in the cool desert night. But the behavior was too consistent, too pronounced. Every single time light touched that trailer's surface, it would shudder like something alive trying to escape an unwelcome touch. The corrugated aluminum sides would ripple in waves from front to back, and for just a moment, the entire structure would seem to contract inward before returning to its normal dimensions. I tried raising the driver on Channel 19, curious if he was experiencing mechanical problems that might explain the unusual movement. Eastbound Kenworth at the 267 marker, you got your ears on. Static answered me, mixed with the distant chatter of other truckers dozens of miles away. I tried again, giving my position more precisely, but received no response. The Kenworth maintained its steady pace, neither gaining nor falling back, its headlights cutting twin paths through the darkness while that strange trailer continued its light-sensitive trembling behind it. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, punctuated by the occasional glow of a distant truck stop or the warning beacons of construction zones. Each time we approached a source of illumination, I found myself watching my mirrors with growing fascination and unease. The trailer's reaction to light was becoming more pronounced, more violent. Under the harsh sodium glare of rest area lamps, the entire structure would convulse so dramatically that I wondered how it remained attached to the fifth wheel. Yet the Kenworth's driver seemed oblivious, never adjusting speed or showing any sign of concern. As we climbed into the Tehachapi Mountains, the road began to curve and wind through terrain that felt increasingly isolated. The few other vehicles we'd been sharing the highway with had taken various exits, leaving just the two of us threading through the darkness. My CB radio picked up nothing but empty static, as if we'd moved beyond the reach of civilization entirely. The familiar weight of my empty trailer felt reassuring behind me, a known quantity in a situation that was becoming increasingly surreal. It was near the town of Mojave that I witnessed something that made me question my own sanity. A slow-moving maintenance vehicle was working the shoulder ahead, its amber warning lights casting orange strobes across both lanes of traffic. As we approached, I slowed to give the crew plenty of clearance, my hazard lights blinking in solidarity with their safety concerns. But when those orange strobes hit the trailer behind me, it didn't just shudder, it seemed to fold in on itself. For a terrifying moment, watching through my West Coast mirror, I saw that 53-foot trailer compressed to perhaps half its normal width. The sides buckled inward like a crushed aluminum can, and I could swear I heard a sound like screaming metal carried on the night wind. Then we passed beyond the range of the warning lights, and the trailer snapped back to its original dimensions with an audible crack that seemed to echo off the surrounding hills. The Kenworth never wavered in its course. Its driver gave no indication that anything unusual had occurred. But now I was certain that whatever rode in that trailer was not meant for the world of daylight and visibility. It was something that belonged to the deep places, the spaces between shadows where normal physics held no sway. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I considered my options. Pulling over seemed unwise. Something told me that stopping would only invite closer attention from whatever presence shared the road behind me. As if responding to my thoughts, the Kenworth began to gain speed, moving up until it was running alongside my tractor. I glanced to my left and felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The cab was empty. No silhouette of a driver. No glow from instrument panels, no sign of human presence whatsoever. The steering wheel turned with precise automated movements, guided by some intelligence that required no physical form. And in the passenger seat, pressed against the window like a pale flower against glass, was a woman's face. She was beautiful in the way that moonlight on water is beautiful, ethereal, insubstantial, tinged with an otherworldly sorrow that seemed to reach across the space between our vehicles and wrap cold fingers around my heart. Her lips moved as if she was speaking, but no sound penetrated the road noise and sealed windows. Her eyes, dark as the desert night around us, held a desperate pleading that made me ease off the throttle despite every instinct telling me to flee. The Kenworth pulled ahead, and as it did, I caught a glimpse of the trailer's rear doors. They were standing slightly ajar, revealing not the expected cargo space, but an absolute void that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. No matter how my headlights struck that opening, they revealed nothing within. Just a darkness so complete it made the star-filled sky above seem bright by comparison. And from that darkness, barely visible at the edge of perception, pale shapes moved like moths drawn to flame, eternally circling something at the trailer's heart. We were approaching the city limits of Barstow when the eastern horizon began to show the first faint suggestion of dawn. It started as little more than a lessening of the darkness, a barely perceptible shift from black to the deepest blue. But the moment that change became apparent, the trailer behind the Kenworth began to shake with increasing violence. The trembling that had marked its reaction to artificial light was nothing compared to this convulsive response to the approaching sun. The Kenworth accelerated suddenly, its diesel engine roaring with desperate urgency, but there was nowhere to run from the coming dawn. No tunnel or overpass long enough to provide sanctuary from the light that was spreading slowly across the eastern sky. I watched in fascination and horror as the trailer began to smoke. Not from fire, but from some internal reaction to the approaching illumination. Wisps of vapor rose from every seam and rivet, carrying with them a scent like ozone and roses and something else. Something that reminded me of childhood fears and half-remembered nightmares. The woman in the Kenworth's passenger seat turned back toward my truck, her face now pressed against the rear window of the cab. Her mouth was open in what might have been a scream or a warning, her hands flat against the glass in a gesture of farewell or supplication. As the first ray of actual sunlight crested the mountains and painted a golden line across the highway ahead, she began to fade like morning mist, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone entirely. The trailer gave one final, tremendous convulsion that lifted it completely off its tires for a moment, that defied physics and common sense. When it settled back onto the roadway, it had become just another piece of freight equipment, unremarkable and ordinary. The Kenworth's cab now showed the familiar silhouette of a driver, probably wondering why he was running 20 miles over the speed limit with no memory of the past several hours. I never learned what that trailer carried through the darkness, or why it feared the light so desperately. The Kenworth took the next exit, heading south toward destinations unknown, leaving me alone with the sunrise and questions that would follow me for the rest of my driving career. Sometimes, during the deepest part of night runs, I find myself scanning the mirrors for trailers that shudder at the touch of illumination, wondering if there are others like it moving through the darkness, carrying cargo that belongs to realms where the sun never shines. The Road That Chooses, from Marcus Webb. I've been driving long haul for 23 years, and I thought I knew every trick a truck could pull on you. The way the engine develops its own rhythm after midnight, how the cab starts feeling like a cocoon when you've been on the road for 14 hours straight, the manner in which your headlights can play against fog and make you see things that aren't there. But nothing prepared me for what happened with Big Bertha, my 2019 Kenworth W990 that I'd been running cross-country for the better part of 3 years. It started on a Tuesday night somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, that long stretch of Interstate 40 where the desert opens up like a mouth and swallows you whole under the star-drunk sky. I was hauling electronics to Dallas, nothing unusual. Just another run in what had been shaping up to be a perfectly ordinary month. The radio was playing that late-night mix of classic rock and trucker gospel that keeps you company when the rest of the world has gone to sleep. And the diesel engine beneath me was humming its familiar lullaby, that deep mechanical purr that had become more comforting than my own heartbeat. The fuel gauge was sitting at about a quarter tank when I first noticed something was off. I'd been planning to stop at the Flying J in Gallup, a place I'd refueled at dozens of times before. But as I approached the exit, something strange happened. The steering wheel seemed to resist my attempt to guide Bertha toward the off-ramp, not violently, but with a subtle insistence, like trying to turn a boat against a gentle current. My hands, weathered and strong from decades of gripping that wheel through mountain passes and prairie winds, found themselves fighting against what felt like the truck's own desire to continue straight ahead. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. Lord knows I'd felt that phantom resistance before, usually when I was pushing too hard and needed sleep more than I needed to make good time. But I was alert, had my thermos full of coffee, and the CB radio chatter was keeping me engaged with the handful of other drivers sharing this lonely stretch of asphalt. I tried again to take the next exit, a smaller truck stop that glowed like a neon island in the darkness ahead. But again, that strange reluctance in the steering, as if Bertha herself was shaking her head and saying, "Not here, not yet." The funny thing was, it didn't feel wrong. That's what I can't quite explain to people when I tell this story. There was something almost protective about it, the way a good horse might resist taking a path that leads to trouble. Bertha and I had been through a lot together, from ice storms in Wyoming to dust devils in Nevada. and I developed the kind of trust you can only have with a machine that's never let you down. So instead of fighting it, I decided to listen. Miles rolled by under my 18 wheels, the desert landscape painted silver by moonlight and the occasional glow of distant ranch lights. The fuel gauge dropped to 1/8 of a tank, then lower. That little warning light beginning to blink its amber concern. Normal procedure would have been to override whatever mechanical quirk was affecting the steering and get to fuel immediately. But something kept me going. Some intuition that whispered this was important, that there was a reason for this strange behavior. That's when I saw it, shimmering in the distance like a mirage that had gotten lost and wandered into the night hours. A truck stop that I'd never seen before, despite having traveled this route more times than I could count. It wasn't on any of my maps, didn't show up on the GPS that usually guided me through unfamiliar territories. But there it was, real as the rumble of my engine, and twice as welcoming. The neon signs were bright but somehow easy on the eyes, casting a warm glow that seemed to push back the desert darkness without harsh edges or garish colors. Bertha's steering immediately loosened as we approached, and she guided herself into the lot with the smooth precision of a ship coming into its home port. The place was busy but not crowded, with maybe a dozen other trucks parked in neat rows, their drivers presumably inside getting coffee and conversation to fuel their own journeys through the night. Everything looked normal, comfortable even, from the clean restroom sign to the promise of hot food 24 hours. But there was something in the air, a quality of stillness that made the ordinary details seem somehow significant. I parked and killed the engine, that sudden silence after hours of mechanical noise always feeling like stepping into a cathedral. The fuel pumps were old-fashioned, the kind with analog dials and the satisfying chunk of heavy machinery, but they worked perfectly, and the diesel flowed into Bertha's tank with the steady rhythm of a strong pulse. While I waited, I studied the other trucks in the lot, noting their varying ages and conditions, from a pristine Peterbilt that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor, to a weathered Freightliner that bore the honest scars of 1,000,000 miles of hard work. Inside the truck stop, the lighting was warm and yellow, the kind that makes everyone's face look kindly and familiar. The coffee was better than it had any right to be, rich and dark without the bitter edge that usually came with late-night truck stop brew. And the woman behind the counter smiled at me with the genuine warmth of someone who understood that truckers were the arteries of America, keeping the country's lifeblood flowing through the long, dark hours when most people were safe in their beds. I struck up a conversation with another driver, an older gentleman with silver hair and laugh lines who was hauling furniture to Phoenix. We talked about routes and weather, the usual trucker small talk, but something nagged at me about our conversation. It took me a while to put my finger on it, but eventually I realized what was bothering me. Every story he told, every reference to time and place, seemed to exist in a kind of eternal present, as if his experiences weren't quite anchored to any specific moment but rather floated in that timeless space between departure and arrival. When I asked him about the truck stop itself, how long it had been there, his eyes took on a distant quality, and he smiled the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach all the way to understanding. "Oh, it's been here as long as it needs to be," he said, which was both a complete answer and no answer at all. Trucks find it when they need to, or maybe it finds them. Hard to say which way the current flows on roads like these. I finished my coffee and headed back to Bertha, that strange unease beginning to settle in my chest like morning fog in a valley. The fuel tank was full, the engine turned over with reliable confidence, but as I pulled out of the lot and back onto the seemingly endless ribbon of interstate, I found myself checking the mirrors more than usual, watching as the lights of the truck stop faded into the darkness behind me. Within minutes it was gone completely, swallowed by the desert night as if it had never existed at all. The rest of the drive to Dallas passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory of that place. The way it had appeared exactly when Bertha's fuel gauge had dropped to nearly empty. The way my truck had seemed to know it would be there. I tried to find it again on my return trip, even took careful note of mile markers and geographical features. But the stretch of highway where I remembered seeing those welcoming lights showed nothing but empty desert and the occasional roadkill that spoke of nature's harsh mathematics. Over the following weeks, it happened again and then again. Never in the same location, never on the same route, but always when fuel was running low and Bertha would develop that strange reluctance to take the obvious exits. Each time, she would guide me to a truck stop that wasn't on any map, where the coffee was always perfect and the other drivers spoke in that same timeless way, their stories floating free from the anchor of specific dates and places. I began to understand that Bertha had developed something beyond mechanical reliability. She had found a network, a web of places that existed in the spaces between the mapped world, truck stops that appeared when needed and faded when their purpose was served. It wasn't supernatural exactly, more like she had learned to read signs that I couldn't see, to navigate by a compass that pointed not north, but toward sanctuary. The last time it happened was 3 weeks ago, somewhere in Montana, where the highway cuts through landscape so big it makes you feel like a speck of dust with delusions of importance. I was low on fuel and fighting a snowstorm that had come out of nowhere, visibility down to maybe 50 feet, and the road turning treacherous with black ice. Bertha's steering had that familiar quality of gentle insistence, and sure enough, through the swirling snow appeared the warm lights of salvation. This time, though, something was different. As I sat in the diner section, warming my hands around a mug of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed by someone who truly understood the art, I noticed that I recognized some of the other drivers. The Weight of Empty Miles, from Marcus Chen. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon stitched through the Oregon wilderness, my headlights carving twin tunnels through the pre-dawn darkness. I'd been driving for 18 hours straight, pushing my limits to make the delivery deadline in Portland, and the caffeine pills were starting to lose their battle against my heavy eyelids. The steady thrum of my Peterbilt's engine had become a lullaby, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of distant voices on the CB radio and the whisper of wind around the cab. That's when I saw her. She stood at the edge of Highway 101, just beyond the amber glow of a flickering streetlight that seemed to be the only sign of civilization for miles in either direction. Rain had been threatening all night, and the air hung thick with moisture that made my windshield fog despite the defroster running full blast. Through the haze, I could make out her silhouette, slight, feminine, wearing what looked like a light jacket completely inadequate for the October chill that had settled over the coastal mountains. Her thumb was raised in the universal gesture that every trucker knows. But something about her posture seemed different. Most hitchhikers I'd encountered over my 23 years on the road had a certain desperate energy about them, a restless shifting from foot to foot, constantly turning to check for approaching vehicles. This woman stood perfectly still, as if she'd been waiting in that exact spot for hours or perhaps days. The thought made me shiver despite the warmth radiating from my truck's heater. Company policy strictly forbade picking up hitchhikers, but I'd bent that rule before when the weather was particularly harsh or when someone looked genuinely stranded. Something about the lonely stretch of road and the woman's motionless vigil tugged at my conscience. I began downshifting, the air brakes hissing softly as I guided the big rig toward the shoulder. My headlights swept across her as I maneuvered, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something odd about the way the light seemed to bend around her, as if she were standing behind glass or underwater. I chalked it up to fatigue and the moisture-laden air playing tricks with the illumination. The diesel engine settled into an idle as I brought the truck to a complete stop, the familiar rumble vibrating through the seat and steering wheel. Through my side mirror, I watched the woman approach, her movement smooth and unhurried. There was no grateful wave, no hurried jog toward the cab that I'd grown accustomed to seeing from stranded travelers. She simply walked with the same measured pace she might use for a casual evening stroll. Rolling down my window, I leaned out slightly, the cool night air immediately raising goosebumps along my arms. "Where are you heading?" I called out, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the thick atmosphere. Up close, I could see that she appeared to be in her 30s with dark hair that hung straight and damp around her shoulders. Her clothes looked like they belonged to a different era, not quite vintage, but not contemporary either. The jacket was a pale blue wool that seemed impractical for hitchhiking, and her shoes were simple flats that would offer little protection against the rough asphalt. "North," she replied, her voice carrying clearly despite being softer than a whisper. It had a quality that made me think of wind chimes on a still day, musical but somehow detached from the physical world around us. "Just north, as far as you're going." There was something unsettling about the way she phrased it, but I'd heard stranger requests from people trying to escape bad situations or simply looking to put distance between themselves and whatever they were leaving behind. I nodded and jerked my thumb toward the passenger side. "Climb on up. I'm heading to Portland, if that works for you." She moved around the front of the truck, passing through the headlight beams again, and once more I noticed that strange optical effect, as if the light wasn't quite hitting her the way it should. The shadows she cast seemed too faint, her edges slightly blurred against the backdrop of forest and asphalt. I rubbed my eyes, attributing the phenomenon to the long hours and the strain of night driving. Perhaps I needed to consider pulling over for a few hours of rest rather than pushing through to make my deadline. The passenger door opened with its familiar metallic groan, and I heard her climbing into the cab. The truck's suspension barely registered the additional weight, which struck me as unusual given how solid and well-built my Peterbilt was. It typically responded noticeably to even small changes in load distribution. I glanced over as she settled into the passenger seat, noting how she moved with that same fluid grace that had characterized her approach. "Thank you," she said, her ethereal voice now filling the enclosed space of the cab. "I've been waiting quite a while." "No problem," I replied, engaging the clutch and beginning the process of getting the heavy truck back up to highway speed. "Not many vehicles come through here at this hour. How long were you standing out there?" She was quiet for so long that I thought perhaps she hadn't heard the question over the engine noise. When I glanced in her direction, she was staring straight ahead through the windshield, her hands folded neatly in her lap. In the glow of the dashboard lights, her skin had an almost translucent quality, and I found myself wondering if she might be ill. There was something fragile about her appearance that made me want to crank up the heater, though the cab was already comfortably warm. "Time moves differently when you're waiting," she finally answered, which wasn't really an answer at all. "Some waits feel like minutes. Others feel like decades." The philosophical nature of her response caught me off guard. Most hitchhikers were either chatty with nervous energy or completely silent, lost in their own thoughts and troubles. This woman seemed to exist in some middle space, present but somehow removed from the immediate reality of sitting in a truck cab at 3:30 in the morning. I found myself stealing glances at her as we rolled through the darkness, trying to pin down what exactly seemed so unusual about her presence. "Are you from around here?" I asked, attempting to maintain some sort of conversation. The silence in the cab had begun to feel too heavy, pressing against my eardrums like the atmospheric pressure before a severe thunderstorm. "I'm from everywhere and nowhere," she said, turning to look at me directly for the first time since entering the truck. Her eyes reflected the dashboard lights in a way that seemed almost luminescent, like an animal's eyes caught in headlight beams. "I go where the road takes me, where drivers like you are kind enough to carry me." Something about the phrasing sent a chill down my spine. Drivers like me, as if she'd ridden with others before, many others, and was drawing some comparison I couldn't quite grasp. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and focused on the white lines rushing beneath us, trying to shake off the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. The miles passed in relative quiet, broken only by the steady rhythm of the engine and the occasional hiss of air brakes as we navigated the gentle curves of the highway. My passenger remained motionless, her hands never shifting position, her breathing so subtle that I began to wonder if she'd fallen asleep. But whenever I checked, her eyes were always open, always fixed on some point beyond the reach of our headlights. We'd been driving for perhaps 30 minutes when the temperature inside the cab began to drop. At first, I thought the heater might be malfunctioning, but the controls showed everything operating normally. The cold seemed to radiate from the passenger seat, a bone-deep chill that made me want to pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. I reached over to adjust the climate control, and my passenger turned her head to watch my movements. "Are you cold?" I asked, though she showed no signs of discomfort. If anything, she seemed perfectly at ease with the gradually dropping temperature. "I'm always cold now," she replied, her breath visible in the suddenly frigid air of the cab. It's been so long since I felt warm. The way she said it made my hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel. There was a sadness in her voice that seemed to echo from some vast, empty space. The kind of profound loneliness that comes from being disconnected from all human warmth and companionship. I found myself wanting to help her somehow, to offer whatever comfort I could to ease whatever burden she was carrying. "There's a truck stop about 40 miles ahead," I said, my own breath now forming small clouds in the rapidly cooling air. "They've got hot coffee, food, warm places to sit. Maybe we could stop for a while, let you warm up properly." She smiled then, and the expression was perhaps the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever seen. It was filled with such infinite sadness and gratitude that I felt tears forming in the corners of my eyes. "You're very kind, Marcus," she said softly. "The Weeping Station," from Marcus Chen. The Interstate 94 stretch between Bismarck and Fargo has always been my least favorite run, especially during those late autumn nights when the wind carries whispers from the empty plains and the darkness seems to press against your headlights, like something alive. I've been hauling freight across the Midwest for nearly 15 years now, and there are certain stretches of highway that get under your skin. Certain places where the GPS seems to lie about distances and time moves differently than it should. That Tuesday night in October, with a load of agricultural equipment bound for Minneapolis, I learned that some places along these lonely highways hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. The fuel gauge on my Kenworth had been creeping toward empty for the last hour, that familiar orange glow reminding me that even the most reliable engine needs sustenance. The CB radio had been crackling with static for miles, occasionally picking up fragments of conversations from truckers dozens of miles away, their voices distorted by atmospheric conditions that made them sound almost otherworldly. Rain had begun to spatter against the windshield around 10:30, not heavy enough to warrant full wipers, but persistent enough to create those hypnotic patterns that can lull a driver into dangerous complacency. When I spotted the neon glow of prairie wind travel plaza cutting through the darkness ahead, relief washed over me like warm coffee on a cold morning. The sign appeared gradually through the rain-specked glass, its blue and white letters promising fuel, food, and that brief human connection that makes the isolation of long-haul trucking bearable. As I downshifted and guided my rig toward the off-ramp, the diesel engine's rumble echoed off the overpass above, creating a momentary tunnel of sound that seemed to muffle even my own thoughts. The travel plaza sat isolated against the prairie backdrop, its parking lot stretching into darkness beyond the reach of the overhead lighting. Several other trucks were scattered across the lot, their running lights creating small constellations in the night. But something about the spacing seemed odd, as if the drivers had deliberately chosen spots as far from the fuel pumps as possible. I pulled into the diesel section, positioning my truck next to pump number 7, the mechanical precision of the parking routine as automatic as breathing after all these years on the road. That's when I first noticed something unusual about the fuel pump itself. In the harsh fluorescent lighting that bathed the fueling area, I could see what appeared to be moisture collecting around the base of the pump housing, small drops that caught the light like tears on a metal cheek. The concrete beneath was damp in an irregular pattern that didn't match the light rain that had been falling. And as I stepped down from my cab, I could hear a faint sound that seemed almost like sobbing, though I dismissed it immediately as wind moving through the pump's ventilation system. The night air carried the usual aromas of diesel fuel and hot asphalt, but underneath those familiar scents was something else. Something that reminded me of salt water and old grief, the kind of smell that lingers in houses where people have cried for too long. I attributed the sensation to fatigue and the strange way that isolation can play tricks on your senses, making ordinary things seem significant when you've been alone with your thoughts for too many hours. As I began the fueling process, inserting my credit card and selecting the grade of diesel, I became increasingly aware of the sound I'd initially dismissed as wind. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, and it seemed to emanate from within the pump itself rather than from any external source. The digital display flickered slightly as it processed my payment information, the numbers wavering in a way that suggested electrical instability, though the pump appeared to be functioning normally otherwise. The diesel began flowing into my tank with its familiar rushing sound, but as the minutes passed, I noticed that the moisture around the pump's base was increasing, rather than evaporating. Small rivulets were forming, creating tiny streams that moved across the concrete in patterns that defied the slight slope of the pavement. The liquid was clear like water, but it had an oily quality that made it bead and flow differently than rainwater should. And when I knelt to examine it more closely, I could see that it was emerging from small gaps in the pump's housing, where the metal panels joined together. The sound of sobbing grew more distinct as I crouched near the pump's base, and I realized with a growing sense of unease that it was definitely not wind or mechanical noise. It was human crying, soft and sustained, the kind of weeping that comes from deep loss and seems to have no end. The rational part of my mind immediately began searching for explanations. Perhaps a radio or phone inside the pump housing, maybe some kind of acoustic effect caused by the night wind interacting with the pump's internal mechanisms. But as I stood and looked more carefully at the pump itself, I noticed details that I'd missed during my initial approach. The metal housing showed signs of corrosion that seemed inconsistent with normal weathering, dark stains that resembled the tracks tears might leave on a face, running from the digital display down toward the concrete pad. The numbers on the fuel counter were advancing normally, but they seemed to shimmer occasionally, as if viewed through water or heat distortion, and the weeping sound continued with a heartbroken consistency that made my chest feel tight with sympathetic sorrow. I tried to shake off the growing sense of wrongness by focusing on practical matters, checking my fuel receipt and calculating how the additional mileage would affect my delivery schedule. But the crying wouldn't fade into the background the way ordinary mechanical noise does. Instead, it seemed to be getting more intense, more personal, as if whatever was causing the sound was aware of my presence and responding to it. The moisture emerging from the pump had begun to pool in larger quantities, creating a small lake around my boots that reflected the overhead lights in ways that made the concrete seem to ripple like water. When I walked around to the other side of the pump to check the automatic shutoff, I discovered that the phenomena I'd observed were not limited to the side I'd been using. The entire pump was weeping, with streams of the mysterious liquid emerging from every joint and seam in the metal housing, and the sound of crying was coming from multiple points, creating a chorus of grief that seemed to fill the air around the fueling station. The other pumps in the diesel section appeared normal, but as I looked more carefully, I could see that they too showed signs of the same corrosion and staining, as if the condition was spreading slowly from one unit to another. The fuel pump finally clicked off, indicating that my tank was full, but as I moved to replace the nozzle in its housing, the weeping sound intensified dramatically. The crying became more urgent, more desperate, accompanied by what sounded almost like whispered words, too distorted to understand but clear enough to recognize as human speech. The liquid emerging from the pump was flowing more rapidly now, creating streams that moved across the concrete with deliberate purpose rather than following the natural contours of the pavement. As I completed my transaction, and prepared to return to my truck, I noticed that several other drivers had emerged from the Travel Plaza's main building and were standing at the windows, looking out at the fuel pumps with expressions of concern and confusion. Their faces were illuminated by the interior lighting, and I could see that they were pointing and talking among themselves, clearly aware that something unusual was happening but uncertain about what they were witnessing. The temperature around the weeping pump seemed to have dropped several degrees, creating a microclimate of cold air that made my breath visible. Despite the relatively mild night, the moisture from the pump was beginning to freeze at the edges, forming delicate crystal patterns that resembled frost flowers, or the intricate ice formations that appear on windows during the deepest part of winter. The crying had evolved into something that sounded like multiple voices, a harmony of sorrow that seemed to echo from inside the earth itself, rather than from any mechanical source. When I reached for my truck's door handle, the voices became suddenly clear, speaking words that I could understand with perfect clarity despite their otherworldly origin. They were calling names, dozens of names, speaking them with the kind of love and loss that comes from permanent separation. Margaret, James, Susan, David. The names continued in an endless litany of loss, each one pronounced with such grief that I felt tears forming in my own eyes in response to the overwhelming sadness that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath the fuel pump. I climbed into my cab with hands that were trembling from more than just the cold. And as I started my engine, the diesel rumble seemed muted and distant compared to the symphony of weeping that filled the night air. Through my windshield, I could see that the liquid emerging from the pump was beginning to glow with a faint phosphorescence, creating pools of soft light that illuminated the concrete in patterns that reminded me of aerial photographs of rivers and tributaries spreading across a landscape. As I pulled away from the fuel pump and began navigating through the parking lot toward the highway entrance, I glanced in my mirrors and saw that the weeping had spread to other pumps throughout the station. The driver who wasn't there. From Marcus Coleman. The first thing you learn as a long-haul trucker is to trust your mirrors. Side mirrors, rear-view mirror, even those little convex ones that show your blind spots. They're your lifeline out here on the endless ribbons of asphalt that connect one nowhere to another. 23 years I've been driving these routes and my mirrors have never lied to me. Not once. Until that foggy October night when I discovered that sometimes the most terrifying truth is what your mirrors refuse to show you. I was hauling a load of furniture from Portland to Denver, my '98 Peterbilt purring like a mechanical cat through the Oregon mountains. The fog had rolled in thick around midnight, turning my headlights into weak yellow fingers that barely touched the road ahead. That's when you really need your mirrors, to know what's behind you, what's gaining on you, what might be lurking in the spaces between the visible world and whatever lies beyond. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, occasionally spitting out fragments of trucker chatter and late-night AM talk shows about government conspiracies and alien abductions. I'd reached over to find a clearer station when I caught something odd in my peripheral vision. My side mirror, the big rectangular one that gives you a perfect view of the trailer and the road behind, was showing nothing but swirling gray fog. Not unusual in itself, except that I could see the taillights of a sedan maybe 50 yards back in my rearview mirror, its headlights cutting weak paths through the mist. I adjusted the side mirror, thinking maybe the vibration from the engine had knocked it out of position. The angle seemed right, pointing exactly where it should to capture the road behind my trailer, but still nothing but fog. Dense, impenetrable fog that seemed to move with a purpose, spiraling in patterns that didn't match the gentle drift I could see in my rearview mirror. I tapped the glass with my knuckle, wondering if moisture had somehow gotten between the layers, creating some kind of optical illusion. The tapping produced a hollow sound, different from the usual sharp rap of knuckle against mirror glass. It reminded me of knocking on a door, waiting for someone to answer from the other side. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. The sedan was still there, maintaining its distance, its driver probably as nervous as I was about the deteriorating visibility. But when I looked back at the side mirror, the fog seemed deeper somehow, more substantial, as if it weren't reflecting the world behind me but showing me something else entirely. Miles passed in this unsettling routine, checking the rearview mirror to confirm reality, then glancing at the side mirror to find only that strange, purposeful fog. The CB radio had gone completely silent now. Not even static, just a dead electronic hum that made the cabin feel more isolated than ever. The heater was working fine, but I found myself shivering anyway, pulling my flannel shirt tighter around my shoulders. That's when I first noticed the absence of my own reflection. I'd been so focused on what the mirror wasn't showing me of the road behind that I hadn't realized it wasn't showing me either. When I leaned forward or shifted my seat, I should be able to catch glimpses of myself in the side mirror's peripheral view. The edge of my baseball cap, the bulk of my shoulder, something to confirm that I exist in the same space as my truck. But there was nothing. Just that fog, growing thicker and more animated with each passing mile. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a lonely collection of diesel pumps and a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The parking lot was nearly empty except for two other big rigs and a rusted pickup truck that might have belonged to an employee. I left the engine idling and climbed down to inspect the mirror, expecting to find some obvious explanation. A crack in the glass, a coating of road grime. Anything that would restore my faith in the logical world. But the mirror looked perfect. Clean, uncracked, properly angled. I could see my own reflection clearly when I stood directly in front of it. Could see the truck stop's neon sign flickering behind me. Could see my breath forming small clouds in the cold autumn air. Everything normal. Everything as it should be. I climbed back into the cab, adjusted my seat, and checked the mirror again. Fog. Nothing but fog. And now I was certain it was moving, swirling in patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, as if something were swimming through gray water on the other side of the glass. Back on the highway, the feeling of being watched intensified, not from behind. The rearview mirror continued to function normally, showing me the occasional pair of headlights or the empty road stretching back into darkness. The sensation came from beside me, from the space that the side mirror claimed didn't exist. I began to understand that whatever was happening wasn't about what I couldn't see in the mirror, but about what I couldn't see of myself. The radio crackled back to life suddenly, but instead of the usual trucker chatter, I heard my own voice. Not exactly my voice. It was similar but flatter, more distant, as if it were coming from very far away or from underwater. The voice was calling out numbers, coordinates maybe, or some kind of code I didn't recognize. I reached for the microphone, intending to respond, to ask who was using my voice and how they were doing it. But when I keyed the mic, no sound came out at all. I tried again, speaking directly into the microphone, but the radio produced only silence while that other version of my voice continued its mysterious recitation. The coordinates, if that's what they were, seemed to be getting closer to something. The numbers decreasing in a pattern that suggested approach, convergence, arrival. My hands began to shake on the steering wheel, and I realized that in the side mirror, there was still no reflection of my trembling fingers, no sign of my mounting panic. The fog in the mirror began to thin, revealing glimpses of a road that wasn't the one I was traveling. This road was narrower, unpaved, lined with trees that looked dead even in the limited visibility. No yellow lines, no reflective markers, no signs of civilization or maintenance. And traveling along this phantom road was a truck that looked exactly like mine, driven by someone I couldn't quite make out through the swirling mist. The mystery driver maintained the same speed I did, turned when I turned, stopped when I stopped for traffic lights in the small towns along my route. But here's what made my blood run cold. In the real world, verified by my rearview mirror and my own eyes, I wasn't stopping for lights or making turns. I was maintaining a steady course on the interstate, following the GPS route I'd programmed hours earlier. The side mirror was showing me a journey I wasn't taking, driven by a version of myself that didn't cast reflections. The voice on the radio continued its countdown, and I began to understand that something was trying to lead me away from my intended destination, to guide me onto roads that didn't appear on any map. I decided to test my theory. Without signaling or changing my actual course, I imagined making a right turn onto a side road. In the rearview mirror, my truck continued straight on the interstate. But in the side mirror, that other truck, driven by that other version of me, turned onto a dirt road that led deeper into woods that grew progressively more twisted and wrong-looking with each passing moment. The voice on the radio was getting more urgent now, the coordinates coming faster, and I realized it was trying to give directions to wherever that phantom road was leading. Part of me wanted to follow those directions, to see where that other version of myself was going, to solve the mystery of the mirror that refused to show me as I really was. But a deeper, more primitive part of my brain was screaming warnings, telling me that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some roads better left untraveled. I reached for the side mirror, intending to adjust it away from whatever signal or dimension it was picking up, instead of the simple reality behind my truck. But as my hand approached the glass, I felt a cold resistance, as if the air around the mirror had thickened into something almost solid. The fog in the mirror swirled faster, and for just a moment I could see the face of the phantom driver clearly. It was my face, but wrong. The features were sharper, the eyes more hollow, the mouth set in an expression of desperate hunger that I'd never worn in any reflection I'd ever seen. This other version of me was looking directly out of the mirror, not at the phantom road he was supposed to be driving, but at me, in my cab, traveling my route. He raised one hand, a hand that cast no reflection in any of my other mirrors, and pressed it against the inside surface of the glass. The radio voice reached a crescendo, shouting coordinates that I somehow knew led to the exact spot where I was driving at that very moment. The phantom me was trying to break through, to trade places, to pull me into that dead forest road while he took over my route, my truck, my life. The sound between sleep, from Marcus. The scratching started around 3 in the morning, just as I was settling into that deep, dreamless sleep that comes after 18 straight hours behind the wheel of my Kenworth T680. I'd pulled into a truck stop outside Bakersfield, California, one of those places where the fluorescent lights buzz like dying insects and cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. The lot was mostly empty except for a handful of other rigs scattered across the cracked asphalt like sleeping giants, their chrome bumpers catching the occasional sweep of headlights from the interstate. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Seattle to Phoenix, a route I'd driven countless times over my 15 years as an owner-operator. The familiar hum of the diesel engine and the steady rhythm of tires on pavement had become as natural to me as breathing. But that night, something felt different. Maybe it was the unusually thick fog that had rolled in from the coast, turning the world beyond my windshield into a gray, shapeless void. Maybe it was the way the truck stop attendant had looked right through me when I'd gone in to pay for fuel, as if I wasn't even there. The scratching was subtle at first, barely audible over the low rumble of my APU keeping the sleeper cab cool. It sounded like fingernails dragging across metal, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere near the back of the trailer. I lay there in my narrow bunk, eyes closed, trying to convince myself it was just the sound of shifting cargo or maybe a tree branch scraping against the aluminum siding in the breeze. But the scratching had a rhythm to it, almost like Morse code. 3 short scratches followed by 3 long ones, then 3 short again. I rolled over and pressed my face to the small window that looked out toward the rear of my trailer. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around the running lights like ghostly fingers. I couldn't see much beyond the red glow of my marker lights, but something was moving back there in the murk. A shadow darker than the surrounding gray, shifting and undulating along the side of my refrigerated unit. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. I could feel it now, a vibration that traveled through the frame of the truck and into my bones. Whatever was making that sound was strong, strong enough to make 48 feet of aluminum and steel shutter with each deliberate scrape. I reached for my flashlight, the heavy mag light I kept clipped to the wall of the sleeper, and slipped into my boots. The air outside was thick and cold, carrying with it the smell of diesel fuel and something else, something organic and unpleasant like wet earth and decay. The fog seemed to muffle all sound except for that persistent scratching, which continued in its steady rhythm. I walked slowly along the length of my trailer, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gray murk in a weak yellow cone. The refrigeration unit was running normally, its compressor cycling on and off with mechanical precision. The cargo I was hauling was medical supplies, vaccines, and pharmaceuticals that needed to stay at a constant 38 degrees. Nothing that should be making noise or moving around back there. But the scratching continued, and as I got closer to the rear doors, I could see fresh gouges in the aluminum siding, deep furrows that hadn't been there when I'd done my pre-trip inspection that morning. I played my light across the back doors, checking the security seal that proved my cargo hadn't been tampered with. It was intact, the plastic band showing no signs of being cut or replaced. But the scratching was definitely coming from inside the trailer now, a steady scraping that seemed to respond to the beam of my flashlight. When I moved the light left, the scratching moved left. When I moved it right, the sound followed. A chill that had nothing to do with the fog ran down my spine. I'd hauled enough loads to know that cargo didn't move on its own, didn't respond to light or sound or the presence of a human being. But something in my trailer was very much aware that I was standing outside, and it wanted my attention. I walked back to the cab and climbed up into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I reached for the CB radio. The lot was quiet except for the usual chatter of drivers checking in with dispatchers or talking about road conditions. I keyed the mic and called out to anyone who might be listening. Breaker 19, this is the Kenworth at the back of the Bakersfield truck stop. Anyone else hearing strange noises tonight? The radio crackled with static, and for a moment there was silence. Then a gravelly voice came through the speaker, distorted and hard to understand. You talking about the scratching sounds, driver? My blood went cold. You hear it too? Been hearing it for about an hour now. Thought it was coming from my trailer, but I checked and everything's secure. Sounds like it's moving around the lot. Other voices joined the conversation. Drivers who'd been trying to sleep but had been kept awake by the same rhythmic scratching. Some said it sounded like it was coming from their own trailers. Others thought it was outside moving between the trucks. But everyone agreed on one thing. The sound was getting louder and more persistent as the night wore on. I tried to raise the truck stop on the radio, but their office was closed and the fuel desk clerk didn't have a CB. The scratching was so loud now that I could hear it clearly over the sound of my idling engine, a steady scraping that seemed to come from all directions at once. Through my mirrors, I could see other drivers getting out of their cabs, flashlights in hand, looking around their rigs with the same confused and growing fear that I felt. The fog was getting thicker, reducing visibility to just a few feet in any direction. The sodium vapor lights in the parking lot created halos of yellow light that seemed to float in the gray void like distant stars. And in that murk, something was moving, something large enough to make the fog swirl and eddy in its wake. I grabbed my logbook and started calculating my hours. I was supposed to take a mandatory 10-hour break, but I still had 2 hours left on my drive time if I needed to get out of there. The scratching was directly overhead now, as if something was walking across the roof of my trailer, its claws or nails leaving gouges in the aluminum. The CB crackled again. All drivers, this is Big Mike in the white Peterbilt. I'm getting out of here. Something ain't right about this place. I watched as running lights began to flicker on around the lot, drivers firing up their engines and preparing to leave. But as each truck tried to pull out, their lights would disappear into the fog after just a few yards, and the sound of their engines would fade to nothing. Then, a few minutes later, I'd see the same running lights pulling back into the lot, the trucks returning as if they'd never left. I tried the radio again. Big Mike, you copy? Did you make it to the interstate? His voice came back confused and shaky. "I don't know what happened, driver. I was heading for the on-ramp, following the road just like always, but I ended up right back here in the lot. It's like the road just loops back on itself." The scratching stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Even the usual sounds of the truck stop, the hum of refrigeration units and the distant rumble of highway traffic had gone quiet. I looked out through my windshield at the fog-shrouded lot and saw nothing but gray void. Then I heard footsteps on the pavement outside my cab, slow and deliberate, coming closer. But these weren't the heavy boots of another trucker. They sounded wrong somehow, as if whatever was walking out there had too many feet, or feet that weren't quite the right shape. The footsteps circled my truck, and I could feel the cab rock slightly as something large brushed against the fuel tank. I held my breath and listened, my heart hammering so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped directly beside my driver's side door, and I heard that scratching sound again, but closer now, right on the metal step below my door. Long, deliberate scratches as if something was carving a message into the steel. The fog began to thin as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, and gradually the normal sounds of the truck stop returned. Diesel engines rumbling to life, air brakes hissing, the distant murmur of CB chatter. I waited until full daylight before I got out of my cab to inspect the damage. The scratches were there, carved deep into the aluminum siding of my trailer and etched into the steel steps of my cab. But they weren't random gouges. They formed symbols, strange markings that looked almost like writing in some language I'd never seen. The mile that wouldn't pass, from Marcus. The thing about driving long haul is that you learn to read the road like scripture. Every mile marker, every exit sign, every green reflection in your headlights becomes part of a familiar liturgy that carries you through the endless hours between one delivery and the next. I've been running freight for 17 years now, and my Peterbilt 379 and I have covered more blacktop than most people see in a lifetime. We know the rhythm of the interstate, the way shadows dance across asphalt, and the peculiar comfort of being the only soul awake in a sleeping world. That night in November, I was hauling electronics from Portland down to Sacramento, riding the lonely stretch of Interstate 5 through the Cascade foothills. The weather had been threatening all day, with heavy clouds pressing down like a wool blanket, and by 10 p.m. the first drops were tapping against my windshield in that tentative way that promises a proper downpour. The radio was cycling through static between stations, so I'd switched it off, leaving just the steady drone of my Caterpillar engine and the whisper of 18 wheels on wet pavement to keep me company. I'd been driving this route for the better part of a decade, knew every curve and climb by heart. The mile markers out here are spaced just right, appearing in my headlight beams at predictable intervals like mechanical heartbeats. Mile 247, mile 248, mile 249, each one sliding past my driver's side window with the dependable cadence that makes night driving almost meditative. The highway signs too have their own familiar rhythm. Green rectangles emerging from the darkness to announce exits I could navigate blindfolded. It was around mile marker 251 that something shifted, though at first I couldn't quite place what felt different. The rain had intensified, drumming against the cab roof with increasing urgency, and my wipers were working overtime to keep the windshield clear. Through the rhythmic sweep of rubber on glass, I caught sight of a highway sign in the distance, its reflective surface catching my headlights like a beacon. Nothing unusual about that, of course, except that this particular sign seemed to be announcing an exit I didn't recognize. The green rectangle read, "Millbrook Road, exit 252, 2 miles," in that standard Department of Transportation font that's the same from Maine to California. I frowned, running through my mental catalog of this stretch of highway. There was no Millbrook Road exit at mile 252. Hell, there wasn't supposed to be any exit for another 15 miles or so. Just empty Forest Service land and the occasional rest stop. But there it was, clear as day in my headlight beams, standing on its aluminum posts like it had been there forever. I glanced at my GPS unit mounted on the dashboard, but the screen was flickering with interference, probably from the storm. Sometimes the electronics get temperamental when the weather turns nasty. No matter, I thought. Highway signs occasionally get updated or changed, and it wouldn't be the first time I'd missed a Department of Transportation announcement about new construction or road improvements. These rural stretches are always being modified to handle increased traffic flow. But as I continued south, something peculiar began to happen. The sign should have grown larger in my windshield, the way all highway signs do as you approach them at 70 miles per hour. Instead, it seemed to maintain the same size, the same distance, as if I were driving on some kind of cosmic treadmill. Mile marker 251 slipped past my window, then another 251, and then impossibly, another 251. The odometer on my dashboard continued clicking forward. The engine maintained its steady rumble, and yet that green sign remained exactly 2 miles ahead according to its own white lettering. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the world beyond my headlight beams into a shifting curtain of silver. I downshifted slightly, feeling the engine brake engage as years of professional driving instinct told me to exercise caution in deteriorating conditions. The sign continued to hover in the distance like some kind of optical illusion, its reflective surface pulsing with each sweep of my wipers. Millbrook Road, exit 252, 2 miles. It proclaimed with bureaucratic certainty, as if repetition could make the impossible somehow logical. I tried the radio again, hoping to raise a traffic report or at least some human voice to anchor me to reality, but found only static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my windshield wipers. The CB radio was equally useless, producing nothing but white noise that almost sounded like whispers if you listened too carefully. Outside my side windows, the familiar landscape of Douglas fir and mountain slopes seemed to blur into an indistinct mass, as if the very geology was becoming uncertain. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank, plenty to reach Sacramento even if I had to detour or backtrack. But something deep in my gut was beginning to twist with an unease that had nothing to do with road conditions or delivery schedules. In 17 years of long-haul driving, through blizzards and desert sandstorms and fog so thick you could cut it with a knife, I'd never experienced anything quite like this sensation of forward motion without progress, of being caught in some kind of temporal loop where distance became meaningless. The sign began to change as I watched, though so subtly at first that I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The number 2 in 2 miles seemed to flicker, wavering between 2 and 1 and back again like a digital display with a loose connection. But highway signs don't have digital displays, just painted aluminum and reflective tape, and the flickering was too regular, too purposeful to be a trick of light and shadow. Then, without any sensation of acceleration or change in my engine's rhythm, the distance on the sign decreased. Millbrook Road, exit 252, 1 mile, it now read, though I was certain I hadn't covered any ground relative to its position. The sign itself seemed to be moving toward me rather than the other way around, sliding down the highway like some kind of mobile billboard, though its posts remained firmly planted in what should have been solid earth. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, as professional confusion gave way to something approaching fear. The Peterbilt's engine continued its reassuring rumble, the tachometer needle holding steady in the green zone. But everything else about this situation violated the basic physics of transportation. Road signs don't move, mile markers don't repeat, and yet here I was, trapped in what felt like a recurring loop of asphalt and reflective metal, watching an impossible exit announcement creep closer with predatory patience. The rain was drumming harder against the windshield now, and through the downpour I began to make out details that shouldn't have been visible at such a distance. The sign's aluminum surface was weathered and pitted, as if it had been standing in the elements for decades rather than the pristine condition you'd expect from new highway infrastructure. Dark stains spread across its green background like water damage or worse, and the white lettering seemed to pulse with its own internal light source. Millbrook Road, Exit 252, 1 mile, the sign now proclaimed, and I could see that the reflective tape around its edges was cracked and peeling. But more disturbing was what appeared to be scratches in the metal surface, gouges that looked almost like claw marks dragged across the aluminum by something with considerable strength and determination. The posts supporting the sign were rust-streaked and bent slightly inward, giving the entire structure an ominous, predatory posture. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the Caterpillar engine respond with increased power. But the speedometer needle didn't budge from 70 miles per hour. It was as if something was governing my velocity, keeping me locked into this strange dance with an exit that couldn't exist. The CB radio crackled with what might have been voices, distant and distorted. But when I grabbed the handset and called for any driver in the area, only static answered back. The sign was close enough now that I could read smaller text that hadn't been visible before. Below the main exit announcement, additional words had appeared in smaller lettering. Services available, fuel, food, rest. But the letters seemed wrong somehow. Not quite the right font or spacing for standard highway signage. They looked hand-painted rather than professionally manufactured, and in the wavering light of my headlamps, some of the words appeared to shift and crawl across the metal surface like living things. Millbrook Road. Exit 252, 500 feet, the sign announced. And now I could see that the exit ramp it promised was actually taking shape in the darkness ahead. A concrete ribbon curved away from the main highway, disappearing into the forest with the kind of gentle grade that engineers design for safe deceleration. Yellow reflector dots marked the lane dividers, and overhead a smaller sign indicated that trucks were indeed permitted to use this route. But none of this should exist. I knew this stretch of I-5 like the back of my hand, had driven it hundreds of times in all kinds of weather and conditions. The Morning Rubber from Marcus Chen. The first time I heard them crying, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on the pre-dawn air, whistling through the truck stop like some lonesome ghost looking for a ride. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to livestock across the endless ribbons of interstate that crisscross this country, and I'd heard plenty of strange sounds in that time. The groan of settling cargo, the whistle of air brakes echoing off empty concrete, the distant hum of refrigeration units keeping their precious loads cold through the small hours of the morning. But this sound was different, soft and mournful, like a child sobbing somewhere just beyond the reach of the sodium lights. I was parked at the Desert Wind truck stop outside Bakersfield, California. My rig pointed west toward the mountains that rose like sleeping giants against the star-scattered sky. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours ago, but I clutched it anyway, letting the familiar weight ground me as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. It was that dead hour before dawn when the world holds its breath, waiting for the sun to crack the horizon and chase away whatever shadows had gathered in the darkness. The truck stop was nearly empty, just a handful of other big rigs scattered across the lot like sleeping whales, their running lights blinking slowly in the gloom. The crying seemed to be coming from somewhere below me, somewhere close to the ground, and as I pressed my ear to the driver's side window, the sound became clearer, more distinct. It wasn't the wind at all. It was definitely voices, human voices, but thin and distant, as if they were coming from very far away or from somewhere they shouldn't be able to come from at all. The hair on my arms began to rise as I realized the sound was coming from directly beneath my cab, from the direction of my front wheels. I'd been having tire trouble for the past week. Nothing serious enough to strand me, but persistent enough to be annoying. A slow leak in my right front tire that forced me to add air every morning. A subtle vibration that suggested one of them might be developing an irregular wear pattern. I'd planned to have them looked at when I reached Los Angeles, but now, sitting in this empty truck stop with those impossible voices drifting up from the asphalt, I wondered if my tires were trying to tell me something more urgent than a simple maintenance issue. Grabbing my flashlight from the door pocket, I climbed down from the cab and walked slowly around to the front of my rig. The crying grew louder as I approached, and I could swear I heard actual words buried in the sound, though they were too faint and distorted for me to make out. My truck was a 2019 Peterbilt 579, midnight blue with chrome that I kept polished to a mirror shine, and in the harsh glare of my flashlight beam, everything looked normal. The tires were properly inflated, their treads showing the expected wear patterns of long highway miles, their sidewalls free of cracks or bulges. But the crying was definitely coming from them. No doubt about it now. I knelt beside the right front tire, the one that had been giving me trouble, and pressed my ear close to the rubber. The sound was clearer here. Multiple voices overlapping in a chorus of grief that made my chest tight with an inexplicable sadness. They sounded like people mourning, like voices at a funeral or a wake, soft and broken and full of loss. I jerked back as if the tire had shocked me, my heart hammering against my ribs. Standing slowly, I backed away from the truck and pulled out my cell phone, thinking I might call the tire shop in town. Maybe get someone out here to take a look, even though it was barely 5 in the morning. But as I scrolled through my contacts, the crying began to change, becoming more urgent, more insistent. Now it sounded less like mourning and more like warning, like voices trying desperately to get my attention, to tell me something important before it was too late. I walked to the other tires, checking each one in turn, and found they were all crying now. All voices soft but distinct in the pre-dawn stillness. The left front tire seemed to be whispering my name. The sound so clear I spun around expecting to see someone standing behind me. The rear tires were humming something that might have been a lullaby, their voices blending together in harmonies that were both beautiful and deeply unsettling. I thought about the hundreds of thousands of miles these tires had carried me, the countless roads they'd rolled across, the truck stops and way stations and loading docks they'd visited. A memory surfaced suddenly, something the old-timer who'd trained me had mentioned once during a late-night run through Nevada. He'd told me that rubber remembers, that tires pick up impressions from every mile they roll, every road they touch. At the time, I'd laughed it off as the kind of superstitious nonsense that long-haul drivers sometimes develop after too many years on the road. But now, kneeling in this empty truck stop with my tires crying like mourners at a grave, the old man's words didn't seem quite so ridiculous. The eastern horizon was beginning to lighten, the sky shifting from black to deep purple, and the crying grew more intense as the dawn approached. I could make out individual words now, fragments of conversations and pleas and warnings that seemed to come from dozens of different voices. Some were speaking English, but others were in languages I didn't recognize, creating a polyglot chorus of anguish that seemed to represent every mile, every road, every journey these tires had ever made. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Among the crying voices, clear as if someone were standing right beside me, I heard my ex-wife Sarah's voice calling my name. She died in a car accident 3 years ago, killed by a drunk driver on a rainy night outside Phoenix. And hearing her voice now, coming from the rubber beneath my truck, nearly dropped me to my knees. She was trying to tell me something. Her voice urgent and frightened, but the words were distorted, stretched thin by whatever impossible medium was carrying them to me. I pressed my ear to the tire again, desperate to understand what she was trying to say, and this time the words came through clearly enough to comprehend. She was warning me about the road ahead, about something waiting for me on the stretch of highway between here and Los Angeles. She kept repeating a mile marker number, mile 247, and telling me not to stop there, not to pull over no matter what I saw or heard. Other voices joined hers now. Some I recognized and others I didn't, all of them trying to warn me about mile 247. I heard the voice of Jimmy Kowalski, an old driving partner who'd died of a heart attack at a truck stop in Oklahoma 2 years back. I heard my grandfather's voice, though he'd never been a trucker, just a farmer who'd passed when I was 12. And underneath it all, I heard the voices of strangers, people I'd never met but whose stories had somehow become embedded in the rubber that carried me down America's highways. The sun was cresting the mountains now, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. And as the first rays of direct sunlight hit my truck, the crying began to fade. The voices became whispers, then silence, until all I could hear was the normal sounds of a truck stop coming to life around me. Other drivers were stirring in their cabs, air brakes hissing as someone prepared to hit the road. The distant rumble of diesel engines warming up for another day's journey. I stood there for several minutes, staring at my tires and wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the memory of Sarah's voice was too clear, too specific to dismiss. Mile 247 was about 2 hours down the road, on a stretch of Interstate 5 that climbed through the Grapevine, a notorious pass known for steep grades and dangerous weather. I'd driven it hundreds of times without incident, but now the thought of approaching that mile marker filled me with dread. Climbing back into my cab, I checked my logbook and calculated my arrival time in Los Angeles. If I left now, I'd reach mile 247 just as the morning rush hour was beginning, with plenty of other traffic around. Maybe that would be safer than waiting, though safer from what, I couldn't say. I started the engine, its familiar rumble providing some comfort, and pulled out of the truck stop as the sun climbed higher into the clear California sky. The drive toward the mountains was uneventful at first, the highway stretching ahead of me like a ribbon of gray concrete bordered by scrubland and distant peaks. But as I approached the Grapevine, I found myself checking the mile markers obsessively, counting down toward the number Sarah's voice had burned into my memory. Mile 250, mile 249, mile 248. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as mile 247 appeared ahead, and I held my breath as I passed the green sign. Nothing happened. No strange sounds, no mysterious figures.